3 hours earlier, my kidney stone surgery had gone perfectly. But at midnight, I screamed so loudly the nurse rushed in. "It's burning my neck," I shouted. "Get it away from me." She pulled the pillow out, examined my skin, then stared at me like I had lost my mind. By morning, there were no marks, no proof, no explanation. Until an old doctor locked the door, clicked on a small purple penlight, and what glowed inside that pillow made both of us go completely silent. Thank you for being here with me. Before we go any further, drop a quick comment for me. What are you doing while you listen? Driving, working, cooking, or winding down? I truly read every comment. Just a heads up, this story includes a few fictional elements added to highlight the lesson. What matters most is the message it carries. I signed a $12 million contract at 7 in the morning, right before they wheeled me through the hospital doors. Earl Thornton, 60 years old, founder of Thornton Capital Group, still closing deals from a wheelchair outside Memorial Hermann Hospital. The Midtown office tower acquisition couldn't wait for kidney stones. I'd built $180 million from scratch in 35 years by understanding one principle: never let someone else hold your files while you're conscious. That morning, June 3rd, I had to break my own rule. My daughter Pilar stood beside the wheelchair in the admissions hallway, 30 years old, and competent in every gesture, wearing the navy blazer I'd bought her when she made junior partner at her firm. She reached down gently and lifted the real estate folders from my lap. "Hey, Dad, I've got these," she said. "Let me carry them. I can manage." "I know you can, but you don't have to right now." I let go. First time in 3 decades, I'd yielded control of my own paperwork. The folders left my hands and I felt something I couldn't name, lighter, maybe, or just older. The wheelchair's armrests were cold metal under my palms. Houston's June heat hadn't reached the air-conditioned hallway yet, but I could see it waiting outside the glass doors, shimmering off the pavement at 8 in the morning. Caspian Hale stood at the hallway's end, hands in his pockets watching us. 35 years old senior partner at Hale and Morrison, my daughter's husband for 4 years. He wore a gray suit that cost what most people spend on a used car, and he wore a smile that looked like waiting for something I couldn't name yet. "How are you feeling, Dad?" he asked, walking closer. He always called me Dad. I'd never given him permission. "Ready to get this over with," I said. Pilar touched Caspian's arm, a gesture so familiar it must have been habit. "He signed a contract this morning," she said, "before coffee." "Of course he did." Caspian's smile widened just slightly. "That's what makes Earl Thornton who he is." The orderly arrived and began wheeling me toward the surgical prep area. Pilar walked beside me, still holding my files. Caspian followed 3 steps behind. I watched the fluorescent lights pass overhead, counting them the way I'd counted floors in office buildings I'd bought over the years. 8th floor, VIP surgical suite. The nurse at the prep station had kind eyes and hands that moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. 2 hours later, I was under anesthesia and the world went away. When I woke in recovery, Dr. Hugo Castellan stood at the foot of my bed, a urological surgeon with steady hands and 20 years removing kidney stones from men who thought they were invincible until biology reminded them otherwise. He had the satisfied expression of someone who just completed a procedure exactly as planned. "Perfect operation," he said. "Stones removed, no complications. 48 hours observation, then home." Pilar squeezed my hand. I squeezed back, though my fingers felt distant and clumsy from the anesthesia. Caspian stepped forward and shook Dr. Castellan's hand with the enthusiasm of a man genuinely relieved. "Thank you, doctor. That's wonderful news." Then he asked his first question. "What's the exact discharge procedure? Any specific paperwork or timing we should know about?" Dr. Castellan blinked, surprised but not suspicious. "Standard post-op. We'll monitor vitals, check for infection, ensure normal urination, resumes. If everything looks good, Wednesday morning, we sign discharge papers, and he's free to go. And if there were any emergency medical decisions while he's here," Caspian's voice stayed casual, almost conversational. "What paperwork would we need for that?" "Medical power of attorney would cover it," Dr. Castellan said. "But for a routine kidney stone procedure, it's rarely necessary. He'll be conscious and capable of making his own decisions." How many times had I sat across from men in suits who smiled like that men who wanted something they hadn't earned? Caspian nodded thoughtfully. "Of course. And one more thing, Doctor, what's the night shift schedule here? Just so we know who to contact if anything comes up." Dr. Castellan glanced at his tablet. "Dr. Iris Pemberton covers nights on this floor. Excellent physician. But again, for post-op kidney stone removal, complications are extremely rare. You're in very good hands." "I'm sure we are," Caspian said, "just being thorough." 3 questions: discharge timing, emergency authorizations paperwork, night shift schedule. I lay there in the recovery bed, watching my son-in-law ask questions that sounded like care, but felt like something else. The anesthesia made my thoughts slow and suspicious. I told myself he was being a good attorney, a careful son-in-law, a man who wanted to understand the process. I told myself the unease crawling up my spine was just drugs and fatigue. I want you to remember those 3 questions, because later, each one will matter in ways I couldn't see through the anesthesia fog. They moved me to room 812 on the 8th floor, a VIP suite with a window overlooking Buffalo Bayou and a bathroom larger than my first apartment. Pilar stayed until 7, then kissed my forehead and promised to return in the morning. Caspian shook my hand, his palm dry and professional, and told me to rest. "We'll take care of everything," he said. The door closed behind them, and the room fell quiet except for the steady beep of the heart monitor and the distant sounds of a hospital settling into evening. Medication cart wheels on linoleum, elevator chimes, voices at the nurse's station discussing shift change. At 8:45, the night nurse came in with a smile and a pristine white pillow. "Let me get you set up for the night, Mr. Thornton," she said. Adina Frost according to her name badge. Mid-40s efficient movements, the professional kindness of someone who'd fluffed 10,000 hospital pillows. "This pillow's fresh from linen service." She lifted my head gently and slid the pillow underneath. It felt clean and cool against my neck. Thank you," I said. "Call button's right here if you need anything." She placed it on the bed rail where my hand could reach. "Sleep well." The door whispered shut behind her. I lay there in the dimmed lights, head resting on a white hospital pillow that looked like every other white hospital pillow I'd ever seen. Clean, ordinary, meant for comfort. I didn't notice it particularly. Just another hospital pillow in a room full of hospital things. I didn't know I should have. I didn't know that in 4 hours it would try to kill me. The fire started at the base of my skull at 2:18 in the morning. Not pain, not pressure. Actual fire spreading across the back of my neck like someone had pressed hot coals against my skin and held them there. I jerked awake thrashing, and the sensation intensified, crawling across my shoulders, down between my shoulder blades, radiating outward in waves that made my spine arch involuntarily. I screamed. Not a yell or a groan, but the kind of animal sound that comes from a body when the brain can't process what's happening to it. My hand went to my neck, expecting to find blood or blistering skin, and instead found only the cool dampness of hospital-issue cotton. The IV line caught on my wrist as I twisted. The heart monitor started shrieking. Footsteps pounded down the hallway. Nurse Adina Frost burst through the door, eyes wide, but movements controlled by training. She reached for my shoulders, trying to steady me without restraining. "Mr. Thornton, you're okay," she said, voice calm and firm. "You're safe. Let me help you." "Something's burning me," I gasped. "The pillow, get it away." She pulled the pillow from behind my head in one smooth motion and tossed it onto the visitor's chair. The burning didn't stop. It kept spreading hot tendrils working their way across the back of my neck, like invisible flames eating through skin I couldn't see. "Let me look." She tilted my head forward, gently examining my neck with a penlight. Her fingers pressed against the nape, cool and professional. "I don't see any redness or irritation. Can you describe what you're feeling?" "Fire!" I said through gritted teeth. Under my neck, started after I laid down. She reached for the call button. "I'm going to get the on-call doctor. Try to breathe slowly. In through your nose, out through your mouth." The burning started to fade after 2 minutes, not all at once, but gradually like coals cooling. By the time Dr. Pierce Holloway arrived, 34 years old, and running on the exhaustion of a third-year internal medicine resident who'd been awake for 20 hours, I could almost convince myself I'd imagined it. Almost. Dr. Holloway had the stethoscope and skepticism combination that comes from medical training charts tell more truth than patient symptoms. Fit diagnoses and unexplained sensations usually have psychological explanations. He examined my neck with careful fingers, checking for heat swelling rash. Found nothing. "I don't see any burns, Mr. Thornton," he said. "Can you describe what you felt? If fire, burning, real burning, it started here." I touched the base of my skull and spread across my shoulders. "Any history of nerve pain, migraines, anxiety disorders?" "And you don't did that sponge and bourgeois and rifts?" "No. Post-operative reactions can manifest in unusual ways." He pulled out his tablet and started typing. "Anesthesia affects the nervous system. Sometimes patients experience sensations that feel very real, but don't have physical causes." I watched him type and knew exactly what he was writing. Patient agitated, suspected cognitive disorder, possible post-operative anxiety. I need you to understand something. When a man who's built everything he has by trusting his instincts tells you something is wrong, and the system tells him he's confused, one of them is lying. Chart it, Dr. Holloway said to Nurse Frost. Likely post-operative anxiety manifesting as physical sensation. Keep monitoring. Call me if it happens again. He left. Nurse Frost reset my IV, straightened the sheets, brought a new pillow, plain white identical to the first. As she positioned it behind my head, I saw something through the partially open door. A shadow. Someone standing just outside the room in the hallway, not moving, not entering, just lingering. Then it disappeared toward the service elevator. Nurse Frost followed my gaze but saw nothing. Try to rest, Mr. Thornton. It's almost 3. You need sleep. She dimmed the lights and left. I didn't sleep. I lay there watching the ceiling tiles and counting my heartbeats until dawn turned the window gray. Morning arrived with the smell of institutional breakfast carts and the sound of shift change. Dr. Holloway returned at 8:15, with Pilar and Caspian trailing behind him. My daughter's face showed the worry of someone who'd received a call about her father screaming in the night. Caspian wore his gray suit and his patient expression. Walk me through exactly what you felt, Mr. Thornton, Dr. Holloway said, tablet ready. I described it precisely. Burning, spreading from the nape, started approximately 40 minutes after I laid down. Real, not imagined, not anxiety. Holloway listened, nodded with professional sympathy, and typed, patient describes sensation of heat, possibly lingering anesthetic combined with post-operative anxiety. Pilar leaned forward. Dad's never been anxious. Is this normal after surgery? And the anesthesia affects everyone differently, Dr. Holloway said. We'll monitor closely. If the sensation returns tonight, we may run additional neurological tests. Caspian stood just behind the doctor's shoulder, positioned where Pilar and I could see his face, but Dr. Holloway couldn't. When Holloway wrote the word anxiety in my chart, my son-in-law's mouth moved. Not a smile, just a tiny twitch at the corner, like someone checking a box on a list. The chart said anxiety. The chart was wrong. The chart was being written by someone who hadn't been burned. Rest today, Dr. Holloway said. We'll reassess tomorrow morning. If you're stable, we'll proceed with discharge Wednesday as planned. He left. Pilar kissed my forehead and promised to return after lunch. Caspian shook my hand, dry palm, firm grip, and said something about handling my business calls so I could focus on recovery. The door closed. I lay in that bed staring at the white pillow beside me on the visitor's chair. Clean. Ordinary. Exactly where Nurse Frost had tossed it during the attack. Exactly like the one now behind my head that she'd placed thereafter. In 14 hours, when my head touched a pillow for the second night, it would burn me again. And the chart would say I was getting worse. The second night I didn't sleep. I counted. I lay in that bed with my head deliberately positioned on the fresh white pillow they had brought. After the first attack eyes fixed on the digital clock mounted beside the heart monitor, the numbers glowed green in the darkness, 2:09 a.m. If the chart said I was confused, I would prove otherwise with data, timing, pattern, the kind of evidence that couldn't be dismissed as post-operative anxiety. My neck still ached from the previous night's burning. 3 faint marks had appeared by noon. Dr. Holloway had photographed them before they faded, noting in his tablet that they could indicate contact dermatitis origin unclear. By evening, they'd disappeared entirely, leaving only the memory and my certainty that they'd return. I counted minutes, watched the clock, kept my head perfectly still against the pillow's surface. 20 minutes, 25, 30. The hallway outside stayed quiet except for occasional footsteps and the distant elevator chime. Someone walked past my door. At 2:34, I heard the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, then silence. 35 minutes, 36, 37. At 38 minutes, 2:47 a.m., exactly the fire started. Same place, base of the skull, same spreading pattern, hot tendrils working across the nape and down between my shoulder blades. But this time, I didn't thrash. I screamed, couldn't help that the pain demanded it, but I kept my head pressed against the pillow and my eyes on that clock. 38 minutes, I said through gritted teeth when Dr. Holloway rushed in 90 seconds later. I counted. From when my head touched the pillow to when this started, 38 minutes exactly. Holloway had the exhausted alertness of someone working his 3rd consecutive overnight shift. He moved quickly, pulling on exam gloves and tilting my head forward under the overhead light. These are visible this time, he said quietly. 3 distinct welts forming a line across the nape. Mr. Thornton, what product do you use on your hair cologne? Anything that could react with hospital linens? Oh, nothing, I said. I use nothing. It's the pillow. He touched the marks gently with one gloved finger, checking for heat and swelling. Found both. We'll have housekeeping check the linen batch, he said carefully, the way doctors speak when they're documenting something they don't fully understand. There could be a chemical residue from industrial washing. Rare, but it happens. You need to understand when a man counts 38 minutes in the dark waiting to be burned, and the burning comes exactly when he predicts, that's not confusion, that's data. Gail Ashford appeared in my doorway while Holloway was still examining my neck. 48 years old nurse manager with 18 years keeping the 8th floor running efficiently, she had the practice concern of someone who'd learned to manage problems before they escalated. Her scrubs were pressed, her ID badge perfectly positioned her expression, perfectly calibrated between sympathy and professional distance. "Dr. Holloway," she said, "I saw the alert. How is Mr. Thornton?" "Visible dermatological reaction this time," Holloway said, stepping back so she could see. "3 linear welts. He reports the onset occurred exactly 38 minutes after pillow contact." Gail moved closer, studied my neck with the kind of clinical assessment that comes from nearly 2 decades of nursing. Her eyes didn't show surprise. They showed something else, calculation maybe, or recognition. "Mr. Thornton, I'm going to take this pillow and have it examined," she said, reaching for the pillow beside my head. "We take all patient concerns seriously." She lifted it with both hands, holding it away from her body the way you'd hold something potentially contaminated. Holloway nodded approval and returned to his tablet, typing notes about chemical sensitivity and linen batch testing. Yeah, I watched Gail Ashford carry that pillow toward the door. She stepped into the hallway, and I saw her through the gap as she pulled the door nearly closed behind her, not all the way, just enough for privacy, while leaving it technically open per hospital protocol. The angle gave me a narrow slice of view into the corridor. No lab bag, no specimen container, no documentation clipboard, just a handoff. Someone was waiting there with a linen cart. I couldn't see their face clearly, just a shape in hospital scrubs, hands reaching out to receive the pillow. Gail passed it over in one smooth motion, the kind of transfer that comes from repetition. No inspection, no examination, no chain of custody form signed or witnessed. The cart wheels squeaked slightly as it rolled away toward the service elevator. The entire exchange took less than 10 seconds. Gail stepped back into my room, hands empty, expression unchanged. "We'll have that analyzed first thing in the morning," she said. "Is there anything else I can get you? Water, a different pillow?" "No," I said. "I'm fine." She left. Dr. Holloway finished his notes and left. The door closed with its soft, pneumatic hiss. I lay there in the silence, my neck still burning the space beside my head, still warm where the pillow had been. The pillow was evidence. The pillow was gone. The pillow had been taken by the system that was supposed to protect me. In a hospital where they tracked every milligram of medication, every vital sign, every visitor badge, scan, a pillow that had left 3 visible burn marks on a patient's neck had just vanished into a linen cart at 2:52 in the morning, without anyone signing anything. Someone knew exactly when to be there. Someone had been waiting with that cart positioned precisely where Gail Ashford would step into the hallway. Someone had received evidence that would never reach a lab, never be tested, never be documented. Someone had done this before. I stared at the ceiling tiles and counted them. Sometime after 3 a.m., I heard quiet footsteps in the hallway that paused outside my door, then continued. I didn't know until months later that Pilar had come back that night and stood outside room 812 for 2 minutes before leaving without knocking. And somewhere in this building, probably already in an industrial washing machine, erasing whatever chemical had burned my neck, was the proof I'd never see again. Someone had done this before, perfected the timing, the handoffs, the disappearing evidence. I spent that morning thinking about systems and how they corrupt about hospitals that track every aspirin but lose pillows, that burn patients about the gap between what gets documented and what actually happens in rooms like mine. Pilar arrived that afternoon with love in her eyes and a pill bottle in her hand. I had to decide in that moment whether the conspiracy had already reached the one person I thought I could trust. Caspian stood in the hallway outside my room, phone pressed to his ear, pacing with the focused energy of someone negotiating something that mattered. He'd been on that phone every time Pilar visited, always urgent business, always just beyond the doorway where I could see him but not hear him. Pilar closed the door behind her and pulled the visitor's chair close to my bed. Afternoon sunlight came through the window at an angle that made her look younger than 30, closer to the girl who'd brought me coffee in my office on Saturday mornings, when she was learning the real estate business from the ground up. "Dad Caspian picked this up for you." She produced a small amber bottle from her purse, setting it on my bedside table. "It's just melatonin natural safe for your insomnia." I picked up the bottle, premium brand, pharmacist label, 5 milligrams, take one at bedtime, as needed. He picked this up himself, I asked. He's worried about you. Pilar's voice carried genuine concern, the kind you can't fake if you've spent 30 years knowing someone. We both are. The doctor said your anxiety. I'm not anxious, Pilar. I'm being burned. She reached for my hand, held it gently. I know you believe that, Dad, and I believe you're in pain. But maybe if you got one good night's sleep, everything would feel clearer. The stress of surgery being in the hospital, it can... The pillow burns me exactly 38 minutes after my head touches it, I said. I counted, twice. Her eyes held something I couldn't quite read. Worry, yes, but also something else. Doubt, pity. The look you give someone you love who's starting to slip away from you. I just try the melatonin, she said softly. One night, for me. How do you tell your daughter that the man she married is using her love as a weapon against you? I couldn't. Not yet. Not without proof that wouldn't make me sound exactly like what the charts were already suggesting. I was confused, anxious, cognitively impaired. So I took the bottle, held it in my palm, felt its weight. Okay, I said, I'll try it. Her face brightened with relief. She kissed my forehead, promised to return tomorrow, and left. Through the window in my door, I watched her join Caspian in the hallway. He ended his call, put his arm around her shoulders, and they walked toward the elevators together. Perfect couple, loving son-in-law, protective daughter. I looked at the pill bottle on my nightstand. That night, I took one tablet at 10:47 p.m., swallowed it with water that tasted faintly of the mineral deposits in Houston's supply. Lay back against a fresh white pillow, they'd brought me 3 new ones that afternoon, all examined by housekeeping, all declared safe. Sleep came heavy and dreamless. Absolute. Like falling into a hole with no bottom and no light. Not the restless half-awareness of normal sleep, but complete erasure. I sank into it the way a stone sinks in deep water, and there was nothing, no dreams, no thoughts, no sense of time passing. When I opened my eyes, Dr. Pierce Holloway stood beside my bed, doing morning rounds. Sunlight filled the room. The clock read 6:12 a.m. Good morning, Mr. Thornton, Holloway said, checking the monitor readings. How did you sleep? I don't know, I said. The words felt thick in my mouth-tongue, still sluggish. What happened overnight? He glanced at his tablet. According to the nurse's notes, you slept remarkably deeply, unresponsive to routine vitals checks from 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. They noted your breathing and pulse were stable, so they didn't wake you. Unresponsive. I pushed myself up on my elbows. I don't remember anything. What does that mean, unresponsive? You were sleeping, Mr. Thornton, very deeply. We checked vitals 3 times, you didn't stir. 3 hours I can't account for. Holloway's expression shifted slightly the way a doctor's face changes when they're reframing symptoms into a diagnosis they didn't want to make. That's not unusual with sleep aids, but combined with your other symptoms, we're noting it for cognitive assessment. I watched him type, watched the words appear on his screen, even though I couldn't see them from my bed. I knew what they said. Patient exhibited unusually deep sleep following melatonin administration, unresponsive to standard vitals checks. Cognitive monitoring required. The cruelest part wasn't that Caspian was attacking me. It was that he was doing it through Pilar's hands. She delivered the medication with love. Real love. I'd seen it in her eyes, heard it in her voice. She genuinely believed she was helping her father sleep after a traumatic few nights. She had no idea the bottle she'd placed on my nightstand was building a medical case for my incompetence. And I'd taken it, swallowed it willingly, created the exact evidence Caspian needed. But here was what Holloway didn't write in his chart. What nobody noticed for the first time in 3 nights the pillow hadn't attacked me. No burning at 38 minutes. No fire spreading across my neck. No screaming, no visible welts, no vanishing evidence that would force them to take my pattern seriously. The one night I took Caspian's sleep aid was the night the torture stopped. That wasn't coincidence. That was orchestration. He knew exactly when the attacks would happen because he was controlling them, and he'd given me medication that would knock me unconscious during the window when they'd normally occur, creating documented memory gaps while simultaneously preventing the very attacks that would prove I was telling the truth. 2 purposes. 1 pill. Delivered by the daughter who loved us both. I sat in that hospital bed, staring at the amber bottle on my nightstand. Pilar had written on the label, in her neat handwriting, "Take one at bedtime, Dad. Love you." My daughter was either the most innocent accomplice in Houston or something I couldn't bear to consider. I didn't know which truth would hurt more. But that night, at 9:47 p.m., the door would open and I would discover I wasn't fighting this alone. The door opened at 9:47 p.m. Marshall Caldwell walked in with the hospital consultant badge he'd kept after retiring from cardiothoracic surgery 3 years ago. Not because he missed the work, but because he'd known me for 40 years and understood that sometimes the people you've built a life alongside need someone who can walk through locked doors. 60 years old, gray at the temples but steady in every gesture, he closed the door quietly behind him and pulled the visitor's chair to my bedside. Didn't ask how I was feeling, didn't glance at the monitor readings or reach for my chart. Just sat down, looked at me for 30 seconds without speaking, and then said the thing nobody else had thought to say. "Tell me from the beginning. Don't leave out a single detail." I felt something crack open in my chest. Not pain, but relief. So sudden it hurt worse than the burning had. "You're not going to check my chart first?" I asked. "I don't need your chart to know you're not confused," Marshall said. "I need your account to know what they're not writing down." So I told him. Everything. First attack at 2:18 a.m., the fire spreading from the base of my skull. Nurse Frost's response. Dr. Holloway's examination, the chart entry about anxiety. Second attack at 2:47 a.m. Exactly 38 minutes after my head touched the pillow, the visible welts that timed 3 distinct marks forming a line across my nape, Gail Ashford appearing in my doorway with practiced concern. The unsigned handoff in the hallway pillow passed directly to someone waiting with a linen cart. No documentation, no lab bag, just smooth transfer and wheels squeaking toward the service elevator. Pilar's visit, the amber bottle, premium melatonin that Caspian had purchased himself, the deep dreamless sleep that followed, waking to discover 3 hours I couldn't retrieve 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. completely erased. Dr. Holloway's note about cognitive monitoring required. The realization that the first night I didn't scream about burning was the night Caspian's medication knocked me unconscious during the exact window when attacks had occurred before. Marshall didn't interrupt once, didn't nod sympathetically, or make the sounds people make when they're humoring someone they think is unwell. He listened with a surgeon's focus, the kind of attention that catalogs every detail, because missing one could mean the difference between saving someone and losing them. When I finished, he sat quiet for 10 seconds. 38 minutes, he said finally. Twice. Same pattern. Exactly. And when you told them, they wrote anxiety. Yes. I know, Marshall said quietly. I read what they wrote. That's why I'm here. 40 years of friendship means this Marshall didn't need me to prove I wasn't crazy. He needed me to tell him who was making me look that way. I'm going to turn off the lights, Marshall said, standing. Don't move. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small, a purple pen light about the size of a fountain pen. The kind surgeons use for vein mapping narrow beam-specific wavelength. What are you looking for? I asked. Evidence that doesn't lie. He walked to the door and flipped the main light switch. The room went dark except for the green glow of the heart monitor and the ambient light from the hallway filtering under the door. Marshall moved to my bedside, lifted the pillow carefully from behind my head, and held it at chest level. Watch, he said. He clicked the UV pen light on and ran the beam slowly along the pillow's seam, the place where my neck would rest, where the base of my skull had touched the fabric for 38 minutes before the fire started. The pillow exploded into stars. Thousands of microscopic particles fluoresced under the ultraviolet light, gleaming like diamond dust, scattered across white fabric, not evenly distributed, concentrated precisely at the contact point, densest where skin would press against cotton thinning, toward the edges but unmistakably present. Not lint, not dust, not anything that belonged there. Engineered material fluorescing at a specific wavelength. We stared at the glowing evidence for 12 seconds in absolute silence. 2 60-year-old men watching proof materialize in the darkness of a hospital room at 10:15 on a Thursday night. Marshall clicked the light off. The glow vanished instantly. He walked back to the door and turned the overhead fluorescence on. Brightness flooded the room, harsh and normal. The pillow looked ordinary again. Clean white hospital cotton. Nothing remarkable. But we'd both seen what was there. The pillow glowed. The pillow was proof. The pillow had been placed by someone who understood chemistry hospital protocols and exactly how long it took to burn skin without leaving permanent marks. What is that? I asked. Marshall set the pillow down carefully on the visitor's chair. Proof, material engineered to fluoresce at 395 nanometers. Whoever put this here wanted it invisible to standard inspection. Can you remove it? Not yet. First I photograph it. He pulled out his phone and took 6 images under UV light, then 6 more under normal lighting for comparison. Then we find out what it is. There are labs that can analyze microscopic particulates, but not through hospital channels. He pocketed the UV light and looked at me in the restored fluorescent brightness. "I'm taking this pillow with me tonight," he said. "In my personal bag, not through hospital systems." I understood what he wasn't saying. Whoever was doing this had access to hospital, protocols could intercept evidence, could make things disappear, the way Gail Ashford had made the previous pillow disappear into a linen cart without signatures or documentation. We were inside enemy territory. The only equipment we could trust was what we carried ourselves. "Sleep sitting up tonight?" Marshall said. "Don't let your neck touch any pillow they bring you. I'll be back tomorrow with results." He lifted the pillow, folded it twice, and slipped it into his leather messenger bag, the same bag he'd carried to surgeries for 20 years. Closed the zipper, slung it over his shoulder. "Hey, get some rest," he said. "Real rest. You're not alone anymore." He left at 10:23 p.m. I sat in that hospital bed, in the silence after the door closed, pillow gone, neck unsupported, first night in 3, knowing exactly what had been burning me, and that someone with medical knowledge and hospital access had put it there deliberately. I slept sitting up for 2 nights, neck unsupported back against raised bed pillow, 30 centimeters away, where I could see it, but it couldn't touch me. Woke every hour checking the distance. By the second morning, my spine felt like someone had threaded steel cable through the vertebrae and pulled it tight. Marshall arrived at 11:30 p.m. on the 3rd night without calling ahead. He carried the leather medical bag he'd retired 3 years ago, and before I could ask why he was there, he raised one finger to his lips, the universal surgeon's sign for silence in an operating room. I nodded. He locked the door from inside, walked to the light switch and turned off the overhead fluorescence, leaving only the small reading lamp beside my bed. Amber glow pooled on the bedside table. Marshall set the medical bag down and opened it with the deliberate movements of someone who'd performed this ritual 4,000 times. Each item came out in sequence, placed on the procedure tray that rolled over the bed, small stainless steel scissors with curved blades, pointed surgical forceps, UV pen light, screw cap specimen container made of glass, sterile cotton swabs and sealed packaging, suture kit with curved needle and medical thread. He laid each instrument with the precise spacing surgeons use, far enough apart to avoid contamination, close enough to reach without looking. Muscle memory from 3 decades in operating rooms. Then he reached into his personal messenger bag and produced the pillow, the one he'd taken from this room 2 days ago, the one that had burned me twice before I understood what was happening. Marshall had kept it safe, not in hospital storage where it could vanish into a linen cart at 2:52 in the morning, not in evidence channels where Gail Ashford could hand it to someone waiting in a hallway. In his personal possession, protected. He shined the UV pen light along the seam one final time. The particles fluoresced instantly, thousands of microscopic points gleaming like stars in the amber darkness. Still there. Still evidence. Still proof. Marshall clicked the light off and set it aside, positioned the scissors at the seam's edge where the fabric met the stitching. For 22 minutes, my friend performed surgery on a hospital pillow. He cut the seam in a single precise line. No jagged edges, no loose threads. The synthetic filling inside puffed gently as air reached it, white polyester fiber, expanding like a slow exhale. Marshall used the forceps to extract material strand by strand. Each piece he isolated caught the reading lamp's light differently, not cotton, not polyester, but something that reflected like platinum wire when separated from the bulk. Glass. Ultrafine glass fibers less than 3 microns in diameter, thinner than human hair, invisible to casual inspection, but brilliant under magnification. I watched Marshall's hands extract each fiber with the same steady control he'd used when I'd watched him operate on my wife's mitral valve 7 years ago. Before the cancer. Before she'd asked him to be honest about time. Before he'd sat in our living room and told us both the truth we already knew 6 months, maybe 8. If the treatment worked 12, if we were lucky, we'd gotten 14. Marshall had held her hand at the end. I'd held the other one. And when her breathing stopped, he'd been the one to check her pulse and nod to me because I couldn't make my own fingers move. Now he was extracting glass fibers from a pillow that someone had weaponized against me, and his hands were just as steady. He placed each sample into the specimen container, with forceps building a small collection at the bottom, enough for analysis, not so much that the pillow would feel different when returned. When he'd gathered sufficient material, he sealed the container's lid and labeled it with indelible marker date time source location, his signature. Then he took the clean cotton filling he had brought in a separate plastic bag and carefully replaced what he'd removed, measured it by eye, adjusted the distribution, made sure the pillow would feel identical to how it had before the surgery. You need to understand, When a man performs surgery on a pillow at midnight, with the care most people reserve for saving lives, he's not just collecting evidence, he's making a promise your enemies will regret forcing him to keep. Marshall threaded the curved needle with medical suture, started closing the incision he'd made, small even stitches that a cardiologist would recognize, the same technique used to close chest cavities after valve replacements. Perfect spacing, perfect tension, each loop identical to the last. No words the entire time. Only sound scissors cutting fabric, forceps clicking against glass, my breathing, the heart monitor's steady pulse, the whisper of thread being pulled through cotton. When Marshall set down the scissors for the last time, he looked at the closed pillow, then at the specimen container, then at me. I looked at his hands, the same hands that had just mended a hospital pillow with precision reserved for mending human hearts. Hands that had held my wife's pulse point and known before I did that she was gone. Hands that had just committed a felony, tampering with evidence, unauthorized specimen collection, operating outside medical protocols, because 40 years of friendship meant some laws mattered less than some people. I had to look away. Emotion makes men dangerous in moments like these. Marshall packed his instruments back into the medical bag. Methodical, reverse order. Everything in its place. He held the specimen container up to the reading lamp one last time. Glass fibers visible through the clear walls, suspended in the bottom like silver dust. "Now we know," he said quietly. 3 words. First words in 22 minutes. I nodded. "Now we choose." "Yes." He pocketed the specimen container, turned the overhead lights back on, unlocked the door, picked up his medical bag and messenger bag. "But morning," he said. "Lab results." He left at 11:52 p.m. I sat in that hospital bed, looking at the pillow Marshall had just surgically repaired. It sat on the visitor's chair exactly where he'd left it. Clean, white, perfectly ordinary, except for the nearly invisible line of medical sutures closing the seam where evidence used to be. 2 60-year-old men in a dark hospital room, one holding surgical scissors, the other holding proof that someone with chemistry knowledge and hospital access had been burning him methodically for a week. The question wasn't whether to fight back anymore. The question was how surgical our revenge needed to be. The answer came at dawn. Marshall left the hospital at 6:47 a.m. with the specimen box in his jacket pocket. When he returned 3 hours later, he brought back 2 pieces of information that changed everything: the scientific name of the weapon burning me, and the legal deadline for how many days I had before my own medical chart could be used to take everything I'd built. He'd driven to a private forensic laboratory where Dr. Iris Pemberton worked. She'd been Marshall's surgical colleague before leaving operating rooms for forensic analysis 15 years ago, running the kind of lab where defense attorneys sent evidence they needed examined without bureaucratic delays or questions about chain of custody. Marshall presented the specimen, requested urgent off-record analysis. 90 minutes later, she had results. Ultrafine borosilicate glass fibers, 2 to 4 microns in diameter, thinner than a red blood cell, invisible to naked eye inspection. But the fibers themselves weren't the weapon. They'd been impregnated with 8.3% pharmaceutical-grade capsaicin concentrate suspended in silicone polymer humectant. Engineered, calculated, precise. Marshall stood beside my bed at 9:32 a.m. holding 8 pages of lab analysis and explained what Dr. Pemberton had found. "This isn't random," he said. "Someone calculated the exact concentration to cause pain without permanent tissue damage." "How precise does that calculation need to be?" I asked. 8.3% capsaicin is pharmaceutical grade, not kitchen pepper extract. The silicone humectant ensures timed release based on thermal activation. Whoever made this understood organic chemistry and thermal activation kinetics. The silicone absorbed body heat gradually over 30 to 45 minutes. When the material reached 98.6 degrees normal human body temperature, the capsaicin activated. Intense localized burning, no permanent tissue damage, marks that faded within 5 to 6 hours. By design. The marks fade in 5 to 6 hours, Marshall said. That's why every morning when doctors examined you, your neck looked fine. You felt it happen at 2 a.m. They saw you at 8 a.m., 6 hours later, nothing visible, just your word against a clean examination. 8.3% capsaicin, pharmaceutical grade, silicone polymer humectant, thermal activation kinetics. Someone didn't just hurt me, they engineered how I'd be hurt when I'd be hurt and how long the evidence would last before disappearing. Marshall photographed every page of the report, sent copies to 3 separate cloud backup accounts before leaving Dr. Pemberton's lab. He understood what I understood in a conspiracy. This methodical evidence had a way of vanishing, but the lab analysis was only the first piece of information he brought back. The second came from my own medical chart. That same morning, Viveka had filed an emergency subpoena for my complete medical record at Memorial Hermann. By noon, she had it. Marshall sat with the printed pages for 18 minutes, reading chronological entries that documented my decline into what the system called cognitive impairment. Day 1, patient reports sensation of heat, no visible cause identified. Day 2, patient overreacts to routine stimuli, exhibits anxiety regarding standard hospital procedures. Day 3, patient stubbornly adheres to self-reported symptoms inconsistent with clinical findings. Day 4 through 7, progressive escalation. Patient becomes increasingly fixated. Patient demonstrates poor reality testing. Patient shows impaired judgment regarding own condition. 3 cognitive assessment indicators entered into the file. No psychiatrist's signature, just Dr. Pierce Holloway's notation after 7-minute encounters where an exhausted third-year resident trusted the narrative frame he'd inherited from nurses' reports and previous entries. Marshall returned to my room at 10:15 and showed me printouts of my own chart. I've read enough medical legal documents to recognize when a chart is being written for a judge, not a doctor, he said. I read the entries, watched my own deterioration play out in clinical language that sounded objective, professional, concerning. Day 1, you report heat, Marshall continued. Day 3, you stubbornly adhere. That's not medical observation, that's linguistic escalation designed for guardianship proceedings. He pointed to specific phrases. Patient demonstrates, patient exhibits, patient shows impaired. Every entry building on the previous one, each word chosen to establish a pattern of declining competence. When does a medical chart stop being a record and become a weapon? When every word is chosen not for diagnosis, but for a judge who'll read it 9 days later in Harris County Probate Court. 3 cognitive indicators, Marshall said. No psychiatrist's signature, just Holloway who spent 7 minutes with you and trusted the frame he inherited. And this language, he tapped the printout, matches Texas Estates Code, Chapter 1101 requirements for emergency guardianship petition. I looked at the entries again, saw what Marshall saw. Medical documentation being systematically compiled to support an incapacity claim. How long, I asked. 9 days of documented symptoms, 3 false cognitive indicators entered by an overworked resident. According to Chapter 1, 1101, that's legally sufficient for Harris County Probate Court consideration. Now, how long until Caspian can file? Marshall met my eyes. With this record, Caspian has 5 days. 5 days. June 8th to June 13th. Marshall placed the lab report on my bedside table, 8 pages of chemical analysis proving someone with pharmaceutical chemistry knowledge had engineered my suffering with precision I couldn't have imagined. Then he set my medical chart beside it. 2 documents, 2 weapons. The pillow was just the delivery system. The real attack was the words being written about me every time I screamed, every time I insisted something was wrong, every time I stubbornly adhered to symptoms that vanished before anyone official could witness them. 5 days, Marshall repeated. After that, Caspian files for guardianship with a chart this complete. Once filed, a judge reviews within 72 hours. If granted, you lose legal capacity to manage your own affairs. Your signature becomes invalid. Your estate falls under court-appointed guardian control. Caspian. Almost certainly, spouse gets priority consideration in Texas family law. I looked at the calendar on my bedside table. June 8th. 5 days meant June 13th. 120 hours to prove I wasn't the confused patient my medical record said I was. 120 hours before my son-in-law could use a court order to take control of everything I'd spent 35 years building. We have the lab report, I said. Proof of the weapon. We have proof someone used industrial chemistry to cause you pain, Marshall corrected. We don't have proof Caspian did it. We don't have proof the medical chart is fraudulent. We have evidence of assault, but guardianship proceedings don't require criminal conviction, just medical documentation of incapacity. He was right. The lab report proved the how. My medical chart provided the legal framework for the why, but we still didn't have the who in a form that would stop what was coming in 5 days. The who revealed himself at 4:23 p.m. in a hospital hallway where security cameras couldn't see. For 12 years, I'd trusted Sherman Gallagher with every detail of my financial life. The visible $40 million, the hidden $140 million in 3 LLCs, the estate plan for Pilar, the contingencies I'd never told anyone except my wife before she died. And at 16:23 on June 8th, Marshall photographed him shaking hands with the man trying to steal it all. Marshall had been leaving my room heading toward the elevator when he glanced down the administrative hallway. Two men stood in a corner alcove, the kind of architectural dead space hospitals have, where corridors meet at odd angles. No camera coverage, just a maintenance door and a window overlooking the parking structure. Sherman Gallagher, 55 years old, the probate attorney who'd represented me since I'd made my first million. He'd drafted every trust document, knew the locations of all 3 hidden LLCs, had sat across from me in conference rooms and explained legal structures so complex even I barely understood them. He had no medical reason to be on the 8th floor at 4:23 on a Thursday afternoon. But there he was, talking quietly with Caspian. Marshall told me later he'd stopped walking, pulled his phone from his pocket slowly, watched through the glass partition from 20 feet away. Caspian handed Sherman a thick manila envelope. Sherman opened it, examined the contents briefly. Whatever was inside made him nod. Not surprise, not shock, just confirmation. The nod of someone verifying that what they'd been promised had been delivered. Then they shook hands. Not the polite handshake of men finishing a casual conversation. The grip of mutual agreement, partnership. The kind of handshake that seals deals worth millions. Marshall lifted his phone and photographed them through the glass. Sent the image to 3 separate cloud storage accounts immediately. Timestamp burned into the metadata, June 16, 2024. Evidence that wouldn't vanish into a linen cart. Marshall returned to my room at 6:40 p.m. and placed his phone on my bed without saying anything. Just turned the screen toward me. I looked at the photograph for 10 seconds without speaking. Sherman's face was clear. Caspian's profile. The envelope visible between them thick enough to contain documents, legal documents, the kind Sherman drafted professionally. Sherman knew everything. The 3 LLCs, the beneficiary structure, the offshore contingencies. Every legal vulnerability I had, he'd helped me create, which meant he knew exactly how to destroy them. He'd drafted my wife's estate 7 years ago, sat in my office the day I signed the Thornton Foundation documents, and told me I was building something that would outlast me. Attended her funeral and held my arm when I couldn't stand straight during the eulogy. And now he was shaking hands with Caspian in a hallway corner with no cameras. Well, I asked Marshall. My voice sounded distant. Yes, all full medical authorization. Being prepared. How many days left? 5. I closed my eyes, counted to 10. When I opened them, something had shifted. Not despair, calculation. The same cold clarity I'd used to close hostile acquisitions when the other side thought they had leverage. I need 48 hours, I said. Marshall waited. To get Caspian here on his own. Confident. Thinking he's won. Thinking I'm so confused I won't understand what I'm signing. Marshall understood immediately what I was planning. His face showed the cost before he spoke it. That means 2 more nights of the pillow, he said. 2 more attacks, 2 more chances your chart gets worse. 2 more entries about cognitive impairment. I know. Caspian could file earlier if he thinks you're deteriorating fast enough. He won't. He's methodical. He'll wait for the full 9 days to build the strongest case. That's what Sherman would tell him to do. You need to understand what I was choosing 48 more hours of fire on my neck. 48 more hours of screaming while they wrote confused in my chart. 48 more hours of Pilar looking at me like I was disappearing. All to buy the time to make Caspian confident enough to walk into this room and finish what he started. I spent 35 years building this by knowing when to take damage to position for the kill, I said. This is that moment. Marshall looked at me for a long time. You're gambling that you can withstand 2 more nights without actually losing cognitive function. Yes. The capsaicin won't cause permanent damage to tissue, but pain that intense repeated it can break people psychologically. I know. And if Caspian doesn't come on his own, if he brings witnesses, if he files early, then I lose anyway, I said. But if I run now, if I discharge myself, if I lawyer up before we have proof if connecting Caspian directly to the pillow he walks. Sherman drafts a new strategy. They wait 6 months and try again with a different method. I'm 60 years old, Marshall. I can't spend the rest of my life waiting for the next attack. Silence filled the room. Outside, Houston was settling into evening, lights coming on across the medical center, traffic sounds from Fannin Street, the ordinary rhythm of a city that had no idea what was happening in room 812. Marshall stood, walked to the window, looked out at the parking structure where Sherman Gallagher had probably left 2 hours ago, envelope in his briefcase partnership with Caspian secured. Are you sure? Marshall asked without turning around. The question I'd been asking myself since seeing Sherman's face in that photograph. I thought about 35 years building Thornton Capital, About my wife who trusted Sherman to draft her final wishes. About Pilar, who'd married a lawyer I'd introduced her to at a charity gala Sherman had organized. No, I said truthfully, but I have no better choice. Marshall nodded once, turned from the window. Then we do this surgically, he said. 48 hours, 2 more attacks. I document everything. And when Caspian walks in here thinking he's won, we end it. He picked up his phone from the bed. I'm going to find Gail Ashford tonight. Show her this photograph. Give her one chance to choose differently. You think she'll turn? I think she's afraid, and afraid people make different choices when they see the trap closing. Marshall left at 6:52 p.m. The pillow sat beside my bed, white and clean and ordinary. In 6 hours it would burn me again. This time I'd let it. This time I'd count every second and remember every detail. Because in 48 hours when Caspian walked through that door, expecting to find a broken man ready to sign away his life's work, I needed to be sharp enough to watch him destroy himself instead. Marshall called me at 11:37 p.m. on June 9th. I'd been lying in that hospital bed counting hours 41 down 79 to go when my phone vibrated. I need to tell you everything that happened after midnight, he said, because you need to understand how many others suffered what you're suffering. So I listened, and Marshall told me about the night Gail Ashford chose between Caspian and survival, and the afternoon he learned my case wasn't the first. He'd waited in the nurse's break room on the 4th floor at 11:45 p.m., knowing Gail's shift ended at midnight. Sat at the table in dim fluorescent light, with a folder he'd prepared printed bank statements showing $85,000 in gambling debt to offshore sites, screenshots of deleted text messages from a burner number registered to a shell company Caspian controlled, a photograph of Caspian and Sherman at Fleming's Steakhouse 2 days before my hospital admission, the kind of photo that doesn't get taken by accident. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and hand sanitizer, Marshall said. Institutional exhaustion. Gail entered at 11:52, exhausted from her shift, saw Marshall sitting there, and froze. Her body language shifted from fatigue to something sharper, fear. She gripped her bag like it might protect her. Just 10 minutes, Gail, Marshall said calmly. Then you choose your own future. She sat. Marshall slid the folder across the table, showed her the debt timeline. Started February, escalated to $85,000 by May. Showed her texts from someone identified only as C, offering debt resolution in exchange for small favors. Showed her the photograph of Caspian and Sherman, together, heads close discussing something that required privacy. Gail's hands shook, but she didn't speak. Marshall's tone stayed conversational, almost gentle. He wasn't threatening her, he told me. He was showing her the box she was already inside. Here's what you don't understand, Marshall said to her. Caspian uses financial pressure to recruit accomplices. Then he eliminates them once they become liabilities. There was another victim 3 months ago, patient 810. Another nurse involved. She took early retirement and moved to Oklahoma within 30 days. You know why? Gail's face went pale, Marshall said. Because she knew too much, and Caspian Hale doesn't leave loose ends. Marshall paused in his telling. I heard him take a breath over the phone. That's when she asked the question I'd been waiting for. What happens to my daughter if I go to prison? Gail had said quietly. Marshall told me that's the moment he knew she'd turn, when fear shifted from Caspian to the law, when she started thinking about consequences instead of just survival. He slid Detective Vivica Blanchard's card across the table, explained the path. Full cooperation meant immunity deal. She testifies the debt disappears into evidence her daughter stays with her, or she stays silent and takes her chances with Caspian's pattern of eliminating witnesses. You have 24 hours, Marshall had told her. After that, the detective comes to you anyway. But without the deal? Gail took the card, left the break room at 12:20 a.m. without another word. Marshall told me he'd sat there 10 more minutes, letting her have space to decide. Then he'd driven home and slept 3 hours before his phone rang at 7 a.m. Detective Blanchard. She had the patient 810 records. They met at the Harris County Civil Courthouse steps at 2:30 p.m. on June 9th. Marshall described it in detail, the heat, the traffic noise on Caroline Street, Vivica, standing there holding an unsealed manila envelope. She introduced herself like she was testifying, Marshall said. Detective Vivica Blanchard, Financial Crimes Division, 23 years on the force, last 11, chasing elder exploitation cases. She told me she'd seen the pattern before, but never had enough to prove it. The envelope contained patient 810's medical records and property transfer documents obtained through subpoena that morning. Herbert Langford, 71 years old, admitted March 15th for hip replacement surgery. Post-operative notes charted mild cognitive impairment and confusion regarding finances. Same language they'd used on me. Discharged March 22nd. 2 days later, Herbert signed a deed transferring his house 4800 Ella Lane in River Oaks worth $2.3 million to Sherman Gallagher. Notary Caspian Hale attorney, witness Gail Ashford listed as family friend. Herbert was admitted to a memory care facility April 2nd. He died May 19th from respiratory failure. The official cause listed was age-related pulmonary decline. The medical examiner had found fiberglass particulates in his lung tissue during autopsy. His family was told he simply deteriorated. Nobody connected it to his hospitalization. Marshall's voice went quiet when he told me the next part. Viveka pulled a second document. Guardianship petition filed for Herbert on March 26th. Withdrawn March 30th after the deed transfer was complete. Exact same pattern. Pillow treatment I couldn't prove. Cognitive impairment I couldn't disprove. Property transfer. Guardianship as backup threat if the victim didn't cooperate. Sherman profited $2.3 million. Herbert Langford never knew what had been done to him. He died believing he had simply grown old. Same nurse, same attorney, same method. This gives us RICO predicate, Viveka had told Marshall. Pattern of criminal enterprise. I'm bringing this to the DA today. If Gail flips, we can indict by end of week. Marshall told me he'd nodded, felt the trap tightening, but Caspian didn't know it yet. Then Marshall's phone had buzzed. Text from unknown number. Your investigator is making people nervous. Accidents happen in parking garages. Marshall showed it to Viveka. She'd said quietly, "He's watching you." "Good," Marshall had replied. "Let him watch." Marshall went silent on the phone. Let me process what he'd told me. I lay in that hospital bed at 11:43 p.m. on June 9th, understanding three things I hadn't understood before. Gail Ashford wasn't evil. She was trapped. And Marshall had just offered her the only exit that didn't end with her being the next loose end Caspian eliminated. Herbert Langford had lost his house to the same conspiracy trying to take my company. I wasn't the first. I was just the biggest target. And Caspian knew Marshall was investigating, which meant the 48 hours I'd committed to enduring had just become more dangerous than I'd calculated. "Are you still there?" Marshall asked. "Yes," I said. "How long until Gail decides?" "She has until tomorrow night. But I think she already decided in that break room. Fear does that. Shows you which direction survival lies. And Caspian's threat?" Marshall was quiet for 3 seconds. "Means we're close. Cornered prey gets vicious. But we knew that when you chose 48 hours. He was right. We'd known. But knowing and feeling the walls close in aren't the same thing. The walls closed in the next afternoon when Pilar arrived alone. She sat by the window 3:15 p.m. on June 9th, and Caspian didn't come with her. First time in a week, he'd missed visiting hours. His absence felt deliberate, like he was creating distance preparing for something that required him not to be present when it happened. Pilar wore the navy blazer I'd bought her when she made junior partner. Her hands gripped her purse too tightly. She looked at me with something I hadn't seen in her face before. Not worry or love or confusion, but calculation. I knew the marriage was already over. "Dad," she said quietly, "how are you feeling?" "Clear," I said. "Clearer than I've been in days." She nodded like she'd been hoping I'd say that. I picked up the hospital notepad from my bedside table, the one I'd been writing on for 20 minutes before she arrived, folded the top sheet carefully, and handed it to her. "Read this somewhere private," I said. "Not here." Pilar took the paper, looked at it like it might burn her fingers. "What is it?" "Not a letter, evidence." She stood, walked to the bathroom, locked the door behind her. I'd spent 20 minutes writing 23 entries on that single page. Each one a transaction Caspian had made over 8 months using access to accounts he shouldn't have known existed. Shell companies I'd structured through offshore entities. Money he'd moved in increments small enough to avoid automatic reporting thresholds, but large enough to total $340,000 by November. I'd discovered them through Thornton Capital's internal monitoring system last fall, alerts that flagged unusual access patterns, withdrawals that matched the timing of Caspian asking questions about estate planning, transfers that coincided with conversations about updating beneficiary structures. I'd known since November he was stealing from me, and I'd stayed silent, because knowing someone is a thief and proving it legally are different calculations. Because confronting him would have meant involving Pilar before I had evidence that would protect her in the divorce I knew was coming. So I'd documented, waited, built the case piece by piece while pretending not to notice. The last entry I'd written, $340,000, came in account 8842-J, November 14th, and I had felt nothing but cold clarity. I sat in that hospital bed listening to Pilar in the bathroom, heard paper rustling, heard her breathing change. No crying, just silence for 90 seconds. Then her voice whispered, you knew, and you stayed silent. Another minute passed. I heard her take out her phone, dial. Wait, I need copies of everything, she said to whoever answered. Account statements, transfer records, everything we discussed, by tomorrow morning. She ended the call, stayed in the bathroom another 3 minutes. When she came out, her face showed no tears. Just the expression I'd seen in boardrooms when she'd decided a negotiation was over, and it was time to close the deal. I love you, Dad, she said. I know, but I'm protecting myself. I know that too. That's why I gave the list to you first, not the detective. She kissed my forehead, left at 3:57 p.m. Marshall called me at 1:14 a.m. on June 10th. Gail came through, he said. I need to tell you what she showed me. He'd met her at 11:45 p.m. in the 8th floor security camera room. Small office with 4 monitors showing different corridors. Gail had the access code from her nurse manager credentials. She'd pulled up footage from outside room 812, showed Marshall the timestamp 11:47 p.m. June 8th. The screen displayed an empty hallway, nurse's station visible at the far end, nobody moving. See the timestamp, Gail had said. 11:47. Watch. The footage played for 47 minutes, then jumped back to 11:47 and repeated. Same empty hallway, same exact sequence. A loop. He did it himself, Gail said. Caspian. He has tech background from law school's cybersecurity concentration. He accessed the system remotely and overlaid the loop to cover midnight to 1 a.m. activity. Marshall had photographed the screen, sent the images to cloud backup immediately. Then he'd asked the question that changed everything. At what was in the oxygen mask, Gail? She'd gone pale. Looked at Marshall for 10 seconds before answering. Capsaicin derivative, she said finally. Pharmaceutical grade, odorless. He had me apply it to the inside of the mask reservoir the first 2 nights. Said it was to help with breathing. I didn't know I didn't understand what it would do. What did it do? Makes nerve endings hypersensitive. Amplifies any irritation 3-fold. The fiberglass in the pillow alone would have caused burning. But with the capsaicin pre-treatment. Her voice broke. He wanted Earl to suffer. Wanted it to be excruciating. Marshall told me, later watching Gail sign, her name was watching someone choose survival over silence. He'd taken out his phone and recorded her full confession. 8 minutes of detail about how Caspian had recruited her, what he'd promised, what he'd threatened, how he'd provided the capsaicin in a small vial with specific instructions about application timing. Then Marshall had written out a witness statement by hand on hospital letterhead. Made her read it aloud while he recorded. Made her sign it. Dated, timed, 12:28 a.m. June 10th. Evidence that wouldn't vanish. Confession that couldn't be recanted without destroying her immunity deal. Gail's hand had trembled as she signed, but she'd signed. It's done, Marshall told me over the phone. Camera loop footage proving tampering. Signed confession about the oxygen mask. Chemical analysis of the pillow. Patient 8-1, pattern. We have enough. Enough for what? Enough to bury Caspian and Sherman both. Yeah, and I heard his phone buzz while we were talking. He went quiet. Marshall, I just got a text, he said. His voice changed. Encrypted number, says she talked. You have 6 hours. From Caspian spams and Boomwetsy's index store, or someone watching for him. I looked at the clock. 1:17 a.m. 6 hours meant 7:17 a.m. Sunrise. The time when hospitals changed shifts and security was thinnest. The conspiracy knew Gail had flipped, and they were giving Marshall 6 hours to understand what was coming. The 6-hour deadline passed at 7:17 a.m. without incident. No attack on Gail, no confrontation with Marshall, just silence that felt more threatening than the warning itself. That morning, Marshall met Detective Vivica Blanchard at a coffee shop in Houston Heights. He told me about it later that afternoon, sitting beside my hospital bed, while I counted down the final hours before I'd let Caspian walk into the trap I was building. Marshall slid the folder across the table at 6:47 a.m. Viveka looked at it for 30 seconds without touching it. Before I open this, she'd said, I need to understand what I'm committing to. You're asking me to investigate a senior partner at one of Houston's top law firms, connected, wealthy, married to your client's daughter. If this goes wrong, careers end, mine included. If it goes wrong, Marshall had replied, a 60-year-old man loses everything he built while his son-in-law takes legal control of his life through fraudulent guardianship. Viveka nodded once, opened the folder. Marshall had organized everything methodically. 14 UV photographs showing fluorescent particles on the pillow. Lab report from Dr. Iris Pemberton confirming ultrafine borosilicate glass fibers impregnated with pharmaceutical-grade capsaicin. Patient 810. Records subpoenaed from Memorial Herman Herbert Langford's complete file showing the identical pattern 3 months earlier. Surveillance photograph of Sherman Gallagher receiving an envelope from Caspian in the hospital hallway. Gail Ashford's signed witness statement describing the oxygen mask sabotage and camera loop tampering. Screenshots of the security footage showing the 47-minute loop. 14 images, Marshall said. Lab confirmation, pattern victim, signed confession, camera tampering, it's all there. Viveka didn't speak. She went through each page slowly cataloging. Marshall told me he watched her face shift from professional skepticism to something darker. Recognition. The expression of someone who'd seen enough elder exploitation cases to know what she was looking at. 20 minutes passed. The coffee Marshall had ordered went cold. Outside the window, Houston woke up traffic building on Heights Boulevard joggers passing the city starting its ordinary Thursday rhythm, while 2 people sat in a corner booth, examining evidence of systematic torture. Finally, Viveka closed the folder. Elder financial abuse, she said. Aggravated assault on elderly person. Conspiracy to commit fraud. Texas Penal Code sections 22.0432.55, 15.02. How long does Caspian get? Marshall asked. 20 years, if we can arrest him. That if carried weight, Marshall told me, he felt immediately. The weight of evidence is not the same as the weight of law. If, Marshall said, Gail's statement is powerful, Viveka explained. But she didn't witness Caspian apply the compound to the oxygen mask. He told her to do it. She did it. That makes her testimony about his instructions hearsay on the assault portion. What about the pillow? The lab results. Proves someone placed engineered material designed to cause pain. Doesn't prove Caspian did it personally. The camera loop proves tampering. Doesn't prove who tampered. Patient 810 establishes pattern of conspiracy involving Sherman and Gale. Still doesn't put Caspian's hands on the weapon. Marshall leaned back. Marshall told me later he'd felt it then, every piece of evidence he'd gathered, every risk he'd taken, every hour of investigation, and they still didn't have what Texas law required for an arrest warrant. So we have motive opportunity pattern confession of conspiracy, and it's not enough, Marshall asked. It's enough for investigation, Viveka said. It's enough to bring to the DA. It's enough to start building a criminal case. But for an arrest warrant, I need a Harris County judge to sign off. And judges want direct evidence of the defendant committing the crime, not circumstantial, not hearsay, direct. What's direct evidence? Video of Caspian placing the pillow, recording of him admitting assault, witness who saw him apply the capsaicin himself. Or, she paused, we catch him in the act. Catch him trying again. Yes. Marshall was quiet for 10 seconds. Outside, Houston moved through its morning. People drinking coffee who had no idea 2 people in a corner booth were discussing whether to use a 60-year-old man as bait. Earl's already agreed, Marshall said finally. He's chosen to endure the attacks for 48 more hours to make Caspian confident enough to come finish it personally. Viveka looked at Marshall like she was reassessing who he was. You told your client to let himself be tortured to build a legal case. I told him we needed Caspian to act directly. He made the choice himself. When he's calculating it will happen within 72 hours. Caspian has a legal timeline, needs to file guardianship petition before the medical record ages out of optimal filing window. That creates pressure. Pressure creates mistakes. Viveka pulled the folder back toward her, opened it again, looked at the UV photographs of the glowing pillow. You understand what you're asking, she said. We wait for assault to occur. We position to witness it. We arrest during or immediately after. If we're 30 seconds too slow, your client suffers. If we're 30 seconds too early, we don't have direct evidence. I understand. And if Caspian doesn't come, if he sends someone else, if he's spooked by the 6-hour warning and backs off entirely, the folder sat between them like a loaded gun no one had legal permission to fire. Then we build the circumstantial case, Marshall said. Take it to the DA, hope a grand jury indicts on conspiracy charges. But that takes months. And in months, Caspian files guardianship petition with a medical record we can't refute. Earl loses legal capacity. The estate falls under court-appointed guardian, likely Caspian. By the time we build a criminal case, everything's already gone. Viveka closed the folder again, sat back. The one who isn't questioned becomes confident, she said. We wait for Caspian to move again, and when he does, we're already there. They were setting a trap, but I was still the bait. Marshall told me this at 2:15 p.m. on June 11th. I had roughly 60 hours left before the 48-hour window I'd chosen would close, before Caspian would come or wouldn't, before the trap would spring or fail completely, before I'd know if choosing to suffer strategically was brilliance or the mistake that cost me everything. The answer about brilliance or mistake came at 2:58 p.m. when I heard their footsteps in the hallway and made myself forget my own son-in-law's name. They arrived at 3 exactly, Pilar wearing the worried expression she'd worn for a week, Caspian carrying the leather portfolio he used for legal documents, the one I'd seen him use at estate planning meetings when we'd sat in Sherman's office discussing my will. I'd prepared myself, counted down from 100 while staring at the ceiling, let my mind go deliberately unfocused. This was the performance that would either save me or destroy the last credibility I had with the one person whose opinion still mattered. "Hello, Father," Caspian said, pulling the visitor's chair close. I looked at him, blinked slowly like I was surfacing from somewhere distant. "Richard," I said, "is it still raining outside the weather in Houston this time of year?" Caspian's face stayed professionally concerned, but I caught at the small glint in his eyes. Recognition. Confirmation. The look of someone whose plan is working exactly as designed. "Dad, it's Caspian," Pilar said gently, sitting on the edge of my bed. "You know Caspian." I looked at her like I was trying to place her face, let confusion flicker across my expression. "Of course," I said. "Of course, I'm just tired. The medication makes everything feel—" I gestured vaguely at the air. 2 minutes passed. I asked about the Midtown office acquisition. Caspian answered patiently, using the tone people use with elderly relatives who've asked the same question 5 times. Then I interrupted him mid-sentence. "Richard, did you check the weather? I can't remember if it's raining." Pilar's hand tightened on mine. "Dad, it's Caspian, and it's not raining. It hasn't rained in 3 days." "Right," I said. "Right, sorry." I watched Caspian watch me, saw him catalog each mistake, saw the satisfaction he was working to conceal. The worst part wasn't lying to Caspian. The worst part was watching Pilar's face crumble with every repeated question. I stared at the blank wall for 45 seconds, let my eyes go unfocused, made my breathing shallow and irregular, like someone whose attention kept slipping away from them. "The merger closed in '87. I said suddenly to no one in particular. "Did I tell you about the merger we were negotiating for 8 months? The other side thought we'd walk. November '87. Or was it '88? "Dad," Pilar said softly, "you've told us about that merger." Have I?" I looked at her. "I don't remember telling you. It was an important deal. 8 months of negotiations." Caspian leaned forward slightly. "Earl, do you remember what year that was?" I blinked at him. 1987 or 88. I keep thinking it was 87, but then I remember. I trailed off, let the thought dissolve into nothing. The room smelled like hospital antiseptic and the faint floral scent of whatever perfume Pilar wore. I focused on those smells, used them to anchor myself while I performed cognitive dissolution. Caspian checked his watch. "Pilar, I should get back to the office. The Whitfield deposition is at 4:30. "Go ahead," Pilar said. "I'll stay a bit longer." Caspian stood, touched my shoulder with what would look like affection to anyone who couldn't see his eyes. "We'll let you rest, Earl. You seem tired today." "Richard," I said, looking up at him, then caught myself. "Sorry, Caspian. I meant Caspian." He smiled, professional concern masking something darker. "It's fine. Get some rest." He left at 3:35 p.m. The door closed behind him. Pilar stayed sitting on the edge of my bed. Her hand still held mine. I waited for her to speak, to tell me what she thought about the performance she'd just witnessed. But her expression changed the moment Caspian was gone. Shifted into something I couldn't read. Not relief, not continued worry. Something else entirely. She leaned close to my ear. Her grip on my hand tightened. I could feel her pulse through her fingers elevated, rapid, stressed. "I know what you're doing," she whispered. Then pulled back before I could respond. Kissed my forehead, stood, picked up her purse. "I love you, Dad," she said in a normal voice, like the whisper hadn't happened. She left at 3:42 p.m. I lay in that bed frozen, unable to move, unable to process what had just occurred. "I know what you're doing." 5 words, infinite possible meanings. Did she know I was performing? Had she seen through the Richard mistake and the repeated questions and understood I was feigning decline deliberately? Was she telling me she was an ally? Or did she think I was genuinely slipping into dementia and doing it to myself through denial? Was she telling me she recognized I was trying to fight something I couldn't control? Or had she read the financial crimes list I'd given her 2 days ago? Did she understand the investigation Marshall was running? Did she know about the trap we were setting and was telling me she understood the larger strategy? I couldn't tell. Her face had been unreadable. Her tone had been neutral. The whisper had been close enough that only I could hear it, but that could mean secrecy or intimacy, or simply not wanting to be overheard by nurses in the hallway. Did she know I was performing, or did she think I was truly losing myself? I stared at the ceiling counting tiles. 47 visible from my bed. Same 47 I'd counted every day for a week. The pillow beside my head was new, fresh from linen service that morning. Marshall had the original in his evidence locker. This one was clean, safe, but I didn't know if Caspian knew that yet. I didn't know if Pilar was ally or enemy or simply daughter watching her father deteriorate. I didn't know if the performance had been convincing enough to make Caspian confident, or so convincing I'd lost my daughter's trust entirely. All I knew was 5 words whispered in my ear, and the sound of her footsteps walking away from room 812 at 3:42 p.m. while I lay there unable to ask what she meant, because asking would break whatever fragile thing we were both protecting. The trap was set, the bait was positioned, the performance was underway. But I'd just discovered the hardest part wasn't fooling my enemy. It was not knowing whether I'd lost my daughter in the process of trying to save myself. Marshall told me later that the recording came from Caspian's own phone. Viveka had obtained a court-authorized wiretap order. At 2 a.m. that morning, Judge Kellerman had signed it after reviewing the evidence package Marshall delivered the night before. Reina Morales, Viveka's technical specialist and former NSA signals analyst, had intercepted Caspian's call through the carrier's lawful intercept system. Everything by the book, everything admissible. The call came at 3:47 that afternoon. Caspian was alone in his office, speaking to someone Marshall later identified as Todd Fenwick, the attorney handling what Caspian believed was a straightforward guardianship filing. I've listened to the recording myself. Since then, Marshall played it for me during one of our debriefing sessions, and what strikes me most is how casual Caspian sounds. No nervousness, no guilt. Just a man discussing business. The medical documentation is solid, Caspian said. His voice had that smooth, reassuring quality I'd noticed during our testing session. 2 independent evaluations showing moderate cognitive impairment. The neurologist's report is particularly compelling. Fenwick's voice came through faintly something about timelines and court availability. I want this filed Monday morning, Caspian continued. First thing, we have already delayed 2 weeks because of Pilar's concerns, and I'm not waiting any longer. Once the emergency petition is granted, I'll have interim authority over the estate. That's when we proceed with the Redmond Holdings restructure. More murmuring from Fenwick. No, she won't contest it, Caspian said, and I heard impatience creeping into his tone. Pilar's protective of her father, but she's not stupid. She knows he's declining. She whispered something yesterday about knowing what I'm doing, but that's just emotion talking. Once the guardianship is in place, her opinion becomes legally irrelevant. That phrase, legally irrelevant, made my skin crawl when I first heard it. The trust restructure happens within 60 days of guardianship approval, Caspian went on. We'll position it as asset protection, shielding his wealth from potential future care costs. Pilar gets her distributions as scheduled. Nothing changes for her financially. She'll grumble, but she'll accept it. And by the time anyone questions the arrangement, the corporate transfers will be complete and effectively irreversible. How do you plan something like that and sleep at night? The recording continued for another 4 minutes. Caspian discussed filing fees, court dates, which judge would likely hear the case. He mentioned Judge Kellerman specifically noting that she tends to favor family caregivers in guardianship disputes, and that his documented relationship with Earl Thornton, 4 years as son-in-law and self-appointed trusted advisor, would weigh heavily in his favor. He wasn't wrong about that. In a normal guardianship case, everything he'd said would have been perfectly reasonable. But this wasn't a normal case. Viveka received the encrypted recording at 4:03 p.m. By 4:30, she had it transcribed and annotated. Marshall hand-delivered the complete evidence package to Assistant District Attorney Lauren Vasquez at 5:42 p.m., the recording, the fraudulent cognitive impairment evaluations. Caspian had commissioned documents. Dr. Holloway confirmed he had never authorized or signed documentation of Caspian's unauthorized access to Earl Thornton's estate accounts and a detailed legal memorandum outlining probable cause. Have you ever watched the moment when justice stops being abstract and becomes inevitable? I hadn't not until Marshall described what happened in that prosecutor's office. Vasquez, a 12-year veteran who'd built her career on elder exploitation cases, worked through the evening with her supervising DA building the probable cause affidavit. She listened to the recording twice, cross-referenced the medical evaluations with the recording's timestamps, verified Gale's signed statement against the camera loop footage. By 9 p.m., she was ready to present. She made 2 calls, one to her supervising DA for final sign-off, one to Judge Mary Ann Kellerman's chambers requesting emergency review. By 10:47 that night, Judge Kellerman had reviewed the affidavit and signed the arrest warrant for Caspian Hale on charges of attempted fraud and conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse. The warrant also authorized seizure of financial records tied to Redmond Holdings. Caspian became a wanted man at 10:47 p.m. on a Thursday evening. He had no idea. Marshall told me he drove past Caspian's house just after 11, that night after Vasquez had confirmed the warrant was being processed and before the judge signed off. The lights were still on in the living room. Caspian's Mercedes sat in the driveway. Somewhere inside that comfortable suburban home, a man who'd spent years positioning himself to steal millions was probably watching television, living his normal evening, completely unaware that by 10:47 p.m. he would become a wanted man. Planning perhaps for Monday morning's guardianship filing, the filing that would never happen. I asked Marshall later if he felt triumphant in that moment driving past the house with the knowledge of what was coming. He said no. He felt sad, because even though Caspian was a predator who deserved everything about to happen to him, his arrest would devastate Pilar. She'd trusted him, looked up to him, considered him almost family. And soon, she'd learn that the man she'd trusted had been planning to exploit her father's vulnerability for his own enrichment. That's the cost nobody talks about, Marshall said to me. We stop the bad guys, we protect the victims, but we can't protect them from the betrayal itself. We can't undo the fact that someone they trusted wanted to hurt them. The arrest was scheduled for Friday morning. Marshall wanted it done at Caspian's office rather than his home, a small mercy for Pilar, who wouldn't have to witness her father's estate manager being led away in handcuffs from the house she'd visited countless times. But that was still 12 hours away. For now, the trap was set. The warrant was signed and Caspian Hale continued his Thursday evening in blissful ignorance of the fact that his entire carefully constructed plan had just collapsed around him. Marshall told me the pillow felt heavier than it should have, and then he cut it open. This happened at 2:15 in the morning on June 12th, 4 days before the trap would either catch Caspian or collapse entirely. I wasn't there. I was in room 812, maintaining my performance for the night nurse, but Marshall described it in detail the following afternoon. Gale Ashford led them to the 8th floor linen storage accessible only with management-level key cards. She'd given Caspian a duplicate card 3 weeks earlier when he'd told her he needed private storage for personal medical supplies. Gale had believed him until Marshall showed her the lab results from the first pillow samples. Locker 14C was tucked in the back corner behind industrial laundry carts. Gale unlocked it with shaking hands. He calls this one the closer, she told them. Higher concentration. For the night he gets the signature. Inside sat a single pillow in a sealed plastic hospital bag. Standard issue from the outside. Marshall lifted it carefully. Too heavy. A pillow that size should weigh maybe 14 ounces. This one felt closer to 2 pounds. Viveka photographed it from 6 angles while sealed then again as Marshall opened the bag and laid the pillow on a clean shelf. She photographed the manufacturing tag, the stitching, the subtle discoloration where something had leached through the fabric. Marshall cut the pillow open with a scalpel. Fiberglass insulation spilled out not fine white filling, but compressed pink material mixed with cotton batting. The concentration was immediately visible. Marshall estimated it at triple the amount from the samples we'd tested 2 weeks earlier. This was escalating to torture, Marshall said, and I heard the anger in his voice when he recounted this. This wasn't about slow exposure anymore. This was designed to cause maximum suffering. Caspian had planned for me to spend my final nights in agony throat-raw lungs, burning every breath, a reminder that I was powerless and he was in control. The signature he wanted wasn't just about legal authority. It was about breaking me first. Viveka photographed the exposed fiberglass, then Marshall got to work. He removed every strand of contaminated filling, bagging it as evidence, and replaced it with clean hospital cotton he'd brought specifically for this purpose. Then, he sewed the pillow closed with surgical precision, matching the original stitch pattern exactly. The whole process took 40 minutes. When he returned the pillow to locker 14C and Gale locked it again, Caspian's weapon was neutralized. On June 17th, when he brought that pillow into my room, confident it contained his final dose, he'd be delivering proof of intent, while administering nothing more harmful than cotton fiber. I watched Marshall sew that pillow closed in my imagination, and understood we were dismantling Caspian stitch by stitch. Pilar came to see me alone on June 13th at 11 in the morning. She'd timed her visit for the shift change gap when the hallway was understaffed. She closed the door to room 812 and sat beside my bed with the posture of someone about to confess. "I knew about the affair 8 months ago," she said without preamble. "I hired a private investigator. I have photographs, hotel receipts, text messages, everything I'd need for a divorce." I waited. This wasn't news I'd suspected Pilar knew more than she'd been admitting, but hearing her say it out loud shifted something between us. "But Texas is community property," she continued. "If I file for divorce based solely on infidelity, I get half of what we built together. If he's arrested for felony fraud involving marital assets, I'm protected under Family Code, Section 7.001. I keep everything." She looked at me directly then, and I saw my daughter as she actually was, not just protective, not just conflicted, but strategic. "I love you, Dad," she said, "and I'm using you. Both are true. I'd known this on some level since the day she brought me Marshall's card. I'd known it when I gave her the list of financial discrepancies instead of handing it directly to Vivica. "I know Pilar," I told her. "That's exactly why I gave the list to you first, not the detective." She exhaled, and I watched 8 months of guilt leave her shoulders. "Both are true," I repeated. "You love me, and you're protecting yourself. I don't need you to choose between those things." She cried then, not the quiet tears she'd been holding back for months, but the real ones. I held her hand and let her grieve for the marriage she'd already lost, and the father she was fighting to save. Honesty doesn't always feel clean, but it feels solid. Dr. Pierce Holloway called Marshall at 2:30 that afternoon. Holloway was my attending physician at Memorial Hermann, 34 years old, a methodical man who documented everything in duplicate, even in his 3rd year of residency. He'd been watching Caspian's medical consultation requests from the beginning. He offered me $25,000. Holloway told Marshall, and Marshall put the call on speaker so Vivica and I could hear. For a second medical signature on a cognitive impairment evaluation form, I documented the bribe attempt and declined. One more piece of evidence, one more thread in the web. Vivica pulled out her legal pad and started mapping the final choreography for June 17th. "You're in the hallway with the warrant," Marshall said to Vivica. "2 uniformed officers with you." "Pilar and I are in the bathroom suite," Marshall continued, hidden but able to hear and see through the cracked door. "I'm standing by as medical witness," Holloway added. "If he presents falsified medical documents, I can testify to their fraudulent nature immediately." "Gale disables the camera loop remotely," Vivica said. 10-minute window. Caspian walks in thinking he's unobserved. "And I feign extreme delirium," I said. "Until he presents the guardianship papers and demands my signature. Then you arrest him mid-attempt." Marshall looked at me. "What if he doesn't bring the pillow? What if he senses the trap? And then we have no plan B," I said. "That's why it has to work. What happens when you build a perfect trap and the prey chooses not to walk into it? You're left with evidence that proves intent, but not action, conspiracy, but not crime. We'd neutralized Caspian's weapon, documented his bribes, recorded his affair, mapped his financial fraud. But without him walking into room 812, on June 17th, with that pillow and those papers, we had threads that didn't quite weave into a prosecutable case. No plan B forces you to get it right the first time. I was betting my life that Caspian's arrogance would outweigh his caution, that he'd believe his plan was too careful, too perfect, too thoroughly constructed to fail. 4 days to find out if I was right. The hardest part of waiting for a trap to spring is pretending you don't know it's there. 4 days of performance had brought me to this 9 o'clock on the evening of June 17th, lying motionless in room 812, while the pieces moved into position. Caspian's arrogance had won over caution. He'd confirmed with Gale that morning he'd be visiting late tonight to check on father and handle necessary paperwork. The trap was live. Vivica arrived at 8:40 in plain clothes, detective shield clipped to her belt. 2 uniformed officers followed Officer Nathan Cross and Officer Elena Martinez from Financial Crimes, both briefed on what they were about to witness. They positioned in the alcove 30 feet down the hallway, out of sight from the service elevator, but close enough to reach my door in seconds. Vivica stood closer, just around the corner, arrest warrant folded in her jacket. Marshall and Pilar entered my room at 9:15, playing concerned family one last time. They spoke to me briefly about weather and dinner, then moved into the bathroom suite. The door stayed open a crack, maybe 2 inches, wide enough to hear everything. Pilar's hands shook when she hugged me goodbye for the cameras. I squeezed her hand twice, I'm ready. She squeezed back once, I love you. Dr. Holloway checked on me at 9:30, performed a brief examination that was mostly theater, and told the floor nurse I was resting comfortably and shouldn't be disturbed. Then he stationed himself in the doctor's lounge 2 floors down, phone ready waiting for Marshall's signal. At exactly 10 o'clock, Gail disabled the camera loop remotely. Hallway cameras, room, cameras, everything disabled, but recording in real time. No gap, no tampering. The police would see exactly what happened and when. Then the waiting began. I lay motionless, eyes closed, breathing shallow and irregular, the way genuine cognitive decline looks. I'd practiced for weeks. The small twitches, the occasional confused murmur, the appearance of barely conscious. My right hand rested on the bed rail, trembling slightly. Fear does the work authenticity requires. 11 o'clock passed, then 11:30. At 11:47, Marshall's whisper from the bathroom so quiet I almost missed it. He'll come between midnight and 1, he told Pilar. That's when Gail said he always came before. Always came before. How many times had Caspian entered this room late at night with poison pillows while I slept? How many nights had he stood where he was about to stand, believing he was untouchable? At 11:55, Viveka's voice from the hallway barely audible. Warrant is active, she told the officers. Wait for my signal. He has to present the documents and pillow first. Midnight. I counted breaths. In for 4, out for 6. The rhythm of someone sleeping, someone vulnerable, someone who didn't know what was coming. 3 hours of waiting compressed into the sound of a single keycard click. 12:04 a.m. The service elevator opened with its mechanical hum, then footsteps, Caspian's footsteps. I knew them the way you know family, the confident pace, the slight drag of his left foot from an old basketball injury, the rhythm of someone who owned whatever space he entered. 4 years of dinners, holidays, conversations. 4 years of watching him play, devoted husband, concerned son-in-law, trustworthy advisor. And now I knew what those footsteps meant. Keycard touched the lock, click. The door to room 812 opened. I kept my eyes closed, breathing shallow. My right hand trembled against the bed rail, no performance required now. Caspian entered at 12:06, moving with practiced quiet. I heard soft fabric rustle, careful footsteps, the sound of someone entering a critically ill patient's room with rehearsed compassion. The door closed behind him. He stood there maybe 15 seconds, watching, confirming I was asleep or too far gone to notice. Then he moved closer. The pillow came first. I felt his hand slide behind my head, lifting gently the way a nurse might adjust a patient for comfort. The old pillow slipped away. The new one, the neutralized one Marshall had gutted and filled with harmless cotton, slid into place. There, Caspian murmured, almost tender. More comfortable now. If I hadn't known what that pillow was supposed to contain, the gesture would have looked like pure caregiving, gentle hands, concerned tone, the perfect son-in-law, making sure his wife's father was comfortable. But I knew. And in the bathroom, Pilar knew. I heard the briefcase open, soft leather, expensive hardware. Papers rustled. I cracked my eyes just enough to see through my lashes. Caspian sat in the chair beside my bed, file folder open on his lap. 3 documents each tagged with bright yellow, sign here, arrows. Medical authorization. Emergency property management authorization. Amended will. All drafted by Sherman Gallagher. All designed to transfer control of $180 million. He clicked his pen, a Mont Blanc, the one Pilar had given him for their 3rd anniversary, and leaned close. Father, he said, voice full of gentle concern, can you hear me? It's Caspian. I need you to sign these forms so we can get you the care you need. And I made a small confused sound. I know you're tired. He continued, placing his hand on mine. His touch was warm. But this is important. For your health, for Pilar. Just a quick signature and then you can rest. He lifted my right hand carefully, as though I were fragile, placed the pen between my trembling fingers, guided my hand toward the first document. Just here, Father, he said. Sign here, then everything will be taken care of. The pen felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, and Caspian's smile never touched his eyes. I looked at the signature line, looked at Caspian's face, so gentle, so concerned, so perfectly masked. Behind him, through the crack in the bathroom door, Pilar was watching her husband reveal exactly who he'd always been. In the hallway, Viveka's hand rested on the door handle warrant, ready, waiting for the moment when attempted fraud became undeniable. I opened my eyes and watched my son-in-law's world end. Not slowly, not the gradual flutter of confused waking. I opened them instantly, completely, with the sharp focus of a man who'd been awake the entire time. A man who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Caspian was leaning close pen, still pressed into my trembling hand, waiting for the signature that would transfer everything. His face was soft with practiced concern, gentle with rehearsed compassion. I looked directly into his eyes and said, "You always call me Dad. I never allowed you to do that." My voice was clear, strong, absolutely steady. The voice of a man who'd never been confused for a single second. Caspian froze. The pen slipped from his grip and clattered onto the tile floor. "Father," he said, recovering quickly, stepping back. "You're confused. You're not well. Let me help you." "I was never confused," I said. "But you were thinking I wouldn't notice my own daughter's inheritance being stolen." The bathroom door opened. Marshall stepped out first, followed by Pilar. They moved quietly, deliberately positioning themselves on the far side of my bed. Caspian's head snapped toward them, eyes wide mouth, opening to say something, explanation, excuse, denial. Then the main door opened. Detective Viveka Blanchard entered with Officer Cross and Officer Martinez behind her. Viveka held the arrest warrant in her left hand, visible, official, undeniable. Caspian's eyes swept the room, in 3 seconds flat, cataloging everything that had just shifted beneath him. The pillow under my head, clean, harmless, not the weapon he'd carefully positioned. The unsigned documents spread across my bed, bright yellow arrows pointing to empty signature lines. The pen on the floor where he'd dropped it. My hand, which had been trembling when he placed the pen in it, now resting steady and still on the blanket. Then he looked at Pilar. She stood beside Marshall, arms crossed, face absolutely neutral. Not angry, not sad, not conflicted, just closed. Every emotion locked behind a wall he'd never taught himself to scale, because he'd always assumed he didn't need to. For 4 years, he'd read her perfectly, anticipated her reactions, calibrated his manipulation to her vulnerabilities. And now, she was standing there, showing him nothing he could read or use. "Caspian Hale," Viveka said, her voice flat and procedural. "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit elder financial exploitation, aggravated assault on an elderly person, and attempted fraud." Caspian turned to face her. The shock was gone, now replaced by something harder, calculated. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his jacket, and produced a tight professional smile. "You have no evidence sufficient to convict me of anything," he said. I nodded to Marshall. Marshall reached into his leather satchel and pulled out a clear plastic evidence box. He placed it on the bed beside the unsigned documents with deliberate care. "A fiberglass insulation sample," Marshall said. "Extracted from pillow in your private storage locker, 14C on June 12th at 02:15 a.m. Time-stamped photograph chain of custody documented." He pulled out a second item, placed it beside the first. "Lab report from Independent Forensic Materials, analyst Dr. Iris Pemberton. Confirms fiberglass concentration consistent with intentional contamination designed to cause respiratory distress." A third item. 14 UV spectrum photographs showing fiberglass particles concentrated at the contact point of your private storage pillow. Each photograph contains embedded cloud metadata, date, time, GPS, coordinates, device identification. Unalterable. Caspian's smile tightened at the corners. Fourth item. Audio recording. 4 minutes, 17 seconds. Your voice and Sherman Gallagher's voice discussing guardianship filing strategy, estate restructuring timeline, and how to position the arrangement so Pilar's objections become, quote, legally irrelevant. Recorded legally under Texas one-party consent law. The smile started to crack. Fifth item. Time-stamped photograph of Sherman Gallagher receiving envelope from you outside Brennan's restaurant on April 3rd. Envelope contained $25,000 cash as retainer for fraudulent legal filings. Sixth item. And signed witness statement from Gail Ashford Memorial, Herman Environmental Services. Supervisor documenting your requests for private storage access, your instructions to replace patient 81, O's bedding on specific schedules, and your admission that you were administering what you called therapeutic exposure. Seventh item. Subpoenaed medical records for patient 810. Herbert Langford, age 71, admitted March 15th for hip replacement surgery. Post-operative chart shows identical cognitive impairment language. Deed transfer to Sherman Gallagher, notarized by you 11 days after discharge. Pattern matches your methodology exactly. I wanted him to see every piece to understand exactly how thoroughly he'd been caught. Not just caught attempting fraud tonight, but documented across months of deliberate harm. I wanted him to know that while he'd been building his careful plan, we'd been building an airtight case. By the seventh item, Caspian's smile had vanished completely. His face had gone pale, lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Marshall laid the evidence like building blocks, each one cementing the walls of Caspian's cell. Texas Penal Code, Section 22.04. Viveka said, stepping forward. Injury to an elderly individual, first-degree felony, 5 to 99 years. She pulled handcuffs from her belt. Caspian Hale, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit elder financial exploitation, aggravated assault on an elderly person, and attempted fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. She turned him around, pulled his wrists behind his back, and snapped the cuffs closed at 12:22 a.m. Caspian didn't resist, didn't speak, just stood there handcuffed, staring at the wall where, 30 seconds ago, he'd believed he was about to become one of Houston's wealthiest men. Viveka's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, nodded once. Sherman Gallagher just entered custody, she said. 2 officers arrived at his office at 12:19. He was printing the final guardianship filing when they knocked. Active conspiracy caught in the act. Exit twist delivered with perfect timing. Sherman had never suspected the trap either. He'd been preparing to file fraudulent guardianship papers at the exact moment his co-conspirator was being handcuffed 4 miles away. Viveka guided Caspian toward the door. Officer Cross opened it. Officer Martinez followed behind, documentation tablet in hand, recording everything. The door closed behind Caspian at 12:28 a.m., handcuffs catching fluorescent hallway light. Viveka's grip firm on his arm. The 8th floor fell silent, except for the sound of 2 sets of footsteps walking away. 1 detective, 1 prisoner. Pilar stood at the window back to me, shoulders shaking. The trap was complete. The silence between us felt heavier than everything that had come before it. Pilar stood at the window for maybe 3 minutes after the door closed behind Caspian. Marshall and Viveka were outside in the hallway, completing arrest procedures, chain of custody documentation, evidence cataloging coordination with the DA's office. Their voices drifted through the door, professional and distant, belonging to a different world than the one Pilar and I now occupied. She turned finally and crossed the room to the chair, where Caspian had sat 20 minutes earlier. Sat down carefully, like the chair might still be warm. Her hands folded in her lap, fingers laced together so tightly the knuckles went white. The silence stretched. I let it. Some conversations can't be rushed. How long have you known? I asked finally. No accusation in my voice, just curiosity. Pilar looked at her hands. Since you were hospitalized, she said quietly. I've known the whole time. The entry twist landed softly, but it rearranged everything I'd understood about the past 11 days. Every moment of her seeming confusion, every hesitation, every ambiguous statement, all of it had been informed awareness. She'd been protecting herself while I worked watching Caspian reveal himself piece by piece. Now, Marshall told you, I said. No, I figured it out on my own. She finally looked up at me. The second night you were here, I came to visit late, found fiberglass dust on your pillow, took a sample to a lab, got the results back 3 days later. And you didn't tell me. I didn't know if I could trust you yet. Her voice was steady, but her eyes weren't. I didn't know if you were part of it or being victimized by it, so I watched. And when you gave me that list of financial discrepancies, I knew. Knew what? That you were building a case. That you needed me to choose sides. That you were giving me the evidence I'd need for the divorce. She was right. I had known on some level exactly what I was doing when I handed her that list. I'd known Pilar would use it strategically. I'd counted on it. I should have told you I knew, she said. I should have helped sooner. You needed to protect yourself first, I said. I understand that. Do you? Her voice cracked slightly. Because I'm not sure I understand it. I watched him hurt you for 11 days while I gathered divorce evidence and waited for someone else to save you. You were watching him reveal himself, I said. That's different than doing nothing. Is it? I didn't have an answer for that. The line between strategic waiting and complicit inaction isn't always clear even to the people standing on it. Pilar's hands unlaced, then laced again. A nervous habit she'd had since childhood. Will you forgive me? She asked. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her. I remembered the girl who learned to ride a bicycle without needing anyone to hold the seat, who'd always chosen independence over reassurance. The woman sitting in front of me now was that same person making the hard choices that prioritized her survival. Some apologies don't come with forgiveness, and some forgiveness doesn't need apologies. We existed in that space between not reconciled, not estranged, just honest about what had happened and what it meant. I don't know, I told her. but I'm glad you're still here." She nodded slowly, not satisfied, but understanding. We sat together in silence for another 20 minutes, not talking, not touching, just occupying the same room, while the hospital moved through its midnight routines around us. At 2:30 a.m., Pilar stood up. "I should go home," she said. "Yes," I agreed. She paused at the door hand on the handle. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said. Not a question. "I'll be here." The door closed behind her. I was alone. I listened to the hospital waking up outside my room, cartwheels squeaking down hallways, elevator chimes marking arrivals and departures, shift change voices, tired nurses handing off to fresh ones, continuity of care documented in quiet professional exchanges. At 4:40 a.m., the door opened again. Marshall entered without knocking, pulled the chair beside my bed without asking, and sat down. No preamble, no explanation, just presence. He looked tired, not the surface exhaustion of a long night, but something deeper, the kind of tired that comes from carrying weight for months and finally being allowed to set it down. "Does it hurt?" he asked. Simple question, complicated answer. "My neck doesn't hurt anymore," I said, for the first time in 11 days. Marshall nodded. We sat in silence watching Houston light up through the window. Buffalo Bayou reflected the last streetlights orange and gold on black water, while the eastern sky started its slow fade from darkness to gray. I'd been thinking about this conversation since the first day I hired him, rehearsing how I'd explain that I couldn't pay what his work was worth, that my assets were tied up in legal proceedings and Caspian's fraud attempts, that even when everything settled, the number on Marshall's invoice would exceed what I could reasonably offer. "You know I won't be able to pay this debt, don't you?" I said quietly. "Not what you deserve." Marshall kept watching the window. "I know," he said. "Then why?" He was quiet for a long time. The sky outside shifted from gray to pale blue, the pre-dawn color that doesn't quite count as morning yet. "Because some debts aren't meant to be repaid," Marshall said finally. "That's why I did it." The exit twist settled over me like understanding. This had never been commerce for him. Not investigation for fee, not service for payment. It had been friendship. The kind of friendship that shows up when someone's drowning and doesn't calculate the cost of the rope before throwing it. The dawn erased the streetlights one by one, Buffalo Bayou fading from reflected gold to ordinary brown water, and I understood what Marshall was saying without words. Some things you do because they need doing. Some people you help because they need help. The transaction is beside the point. Marshall left at 5:03 a.m. without another word, just a hand on my shoulder, brief pressure, solid and warm, then gone. I lay in the hospital bed watching full morning arrive. The pillow under my head felt different. Not because it was different, but because I knew what it was now. Just cotton and fabric. Just a pillow. For the first time in 11 days, I closed my eyes without checking it first. Christmas lights blinked outside the courthouse windows while the judge sentenced the man who tried to steal my life. I slept for 14 hours after Marshall left that June morning. Real sleep, the kind that comes when your body finally believes the danger has passed. I woke up at 7 p.m. to find Dr. Holloway standing beside my bed, running discharge paperwork. 3 days later, I went home. 4 months after that, I sat in Harris County District Courtroom, 177, watching justice grind forward with mechanical precision. The preliminary hearing happened on October 15th. Caspian sat at the defense table in county-issued orange hands, folded face carefully neutral. Sherman Gallagher sat 3 seats away at a separate table with his own attorney, the distance between them a silent acknowledgement that their conspiracy had dissolved the moment the handcuffs closed. The assistant district attorney, a woman named Catherine Reyes, who specialized in elder exploitation cases, stood and read the charges against Caspian in a flat procedural voice that made horror sound like paperwork. 6 counts of felony, first degree, she said. Aggravated assault on elderly person under Texas Penal Code, Section 22.04. Exploitation of elderly with intent to defraud under Section 32.53. Conspiracy under Section 15.02, fraud under Section 32.46, tampering with evidence under Section 37.09, criminal solicitation under Section 15.03. Sherman faced 4 related charges: conspiracy, fraud, solicitation, professional misconduct. The evidence package sat on the prosecutor's table in organized stacks, conspiracy recordings, with time-stamped transcripts, laboratory reports with expert signatures. Gale's notarized witness statement, patient 8-1. O's subpoenaed medical records showing the pattern Caspian had used before. 14 UV spectrum photographs with embedded metadata, financial transaction records, hotel security footage, text messages recovered from encrypted backups. Despite the June arrest and overwhelming evidence, the legal process took 5 months. Justice is methodical and slow-draining even in victory. Each procedural delay, each scheduling conflict, each motion filed and answered added weeks to the timeline. By October, I understood that catching someone and convicting them are entirely different timescales. Caspian's defense attorney, a tired-looking man named Howard Brennan, who'd clearly drawn the short straw on this case, leaned close to his client during the lunch recess. I was sitting 3 rows back, close enough to hear. "They have recordings lab evidence pattern victim witness testimony," Brennan said quietly. "A jury will convict in 2 hours. Take the plea." Caspian stared at the table for a long time. On October 28th, he signed the plea agreement. I watched him do it. Watched the pen move across the signature line in the same confident script he'd used to sign birthday cards and thank you notes, and the fraudulent guardianship documents he'd brought into room 812. His hand didn't shake. "I understand and accept the terms," he said. Sherman signed his plea agreement a week later, on November 4th, after his attorney negotiated permanent state bar license revocation in exchange for reduced prison time. I watched Caspian sign the plea agreement and felt nothing, not relief, not anger, just the weight of knowing it was finally ending. The sentencing hearing happened 3 weeks later, on November 21st. Early Christmas lights had gone up, the week before red and green blinking along the courthouse perimeter, festive and absurd against the gray November sky. Judge Robert Carson presided Harris County District Court, 177 years, on the criminal bench known for methodical sentencing and elder abuse cases. He was 62, with steel gray hair and reading glasses that sat halfway down his nose, the kind of judge who read every page of every brief and asked questions that proved it. The courtroom smelled like old wood and recirculated air, and the faint chemical tang of industrial floor cleaner. Pilar sat beside me in the gallery. Marshall sat on my other side. Viveka was there too. In the row behind us, her presence solid and quiet. Judge Carson asked if I wanted to read a victim impact statement. I stood and walked to the lectern with a single page of handwritten notes I'd prepared the night before. I'd thought about what to say for weeks, considered emotional appeals, descriptions of suffering, explanations of trust betrayed. But when I looked at that blank page, I realized the facts were enough. The truth didn't need decoration. "It's 6 attacks," I read. 14 days hospitalized. $287,000 in medical expenses. 14 nights not knowing which caregivers actually cared. I looked up from my notes. I hired nurses I couldn't trust. I questioned family members who were trying to help me. I lay awake counting threats that didn't exist while missing the one that did. That's what this kind of crime costs. Not just money, not just health, the ability to know who's safe. I sat down. The courtroom was silent. Caspian's attorney stood for cross-examination, a last attempt at mitigation, at creating some sliver of doubt that might reduce the sentence. "Mr. Thornton," he said, "isn't it possible you were confused due to post-surgical anesthetic, that your perceptions during hospitalization were compromised by medication?" I looked directly at Caspian. He met my eyes for maybe half a second, then looked away. "Anesthetic wouldn't leave fiberglass embedded in the pillow," I said. The courtroom went silent after my answer, and I realized the truth doesn't need elaboration, just clarity, just the single fact that makes every other explanation irrelevant. Brennan sat down without another question. Judge Carson reviewed the sentencing guidelines, the plea agreements, the evidence summaries. He took his time. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and final. "Caspian Hale," he said. 18 years Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Mandatory minimum 9 years, without possibility of parole for felony first-degree assault on elderly person. Credit for time served since June 18th. He turned to Sherman's table. Sherman Gallagher. 6 years Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Permanent revocation of state bar license. $2.3 million, restitution to the estate of Herbert Langford, whose home was stolen and whose life was cut short by conduct you facilitated. Patient 8-1. Had a name now. Herbert Langford. 71 years old. A man who had spent his life building something worth $2.3 million, then spent his final months in a facility paid for by a trust, the man who stole from him still controlled. Sherman had provided the legal framework that made it possible. $2.3 million going to Herbert's estate wouldn't undo any of that, but it was accountability. And accountability was something. The gavel fell at 11:47 a.m. on November 21st, 2024. 18 years, 9 minimum. Neither Pilar nor I cried. We'd done our crying months ago in hospital rooms and late-night conversations, and the slow, grinding realization of how close I'd come to losing everything. We stood, walked past Caspian in his orange jumpsuit and restraints, left the courtroom without looking back. The Christmas lights were still blinking when we stepped outside into cold November air. The morning after justice, we stood on courthouse steps and said goodbye to people we hoped never to meet again. November cold had settled into Houston overnight, the kind of cold that doesn't freeze but seeps into your bones and reminds you winter exists even this far south. Vivica stood 3 steps down from me, hands in her coat pockets, looking like someone who'd already moved on mentally to the next case. She extended her hand, not for a procedural evidence exchange or a formal interview introduction, just a handshake between 2 people who'd worked something difficult and survived it. "Best witness I ever worked with, Mr. Thornton," she said. "You got the warrant at exactly the right time, Detective," I replied. Her grip was firm, brief, professional. Then she released and walked down the courthouse steps toward the parking garage. I watched her go and understood we'd probably never see each other again unless something terrible happened. We were both okay with that. Pilar stood beside me quietly. She'd been quiet since we left the courtroom the day before, processing something I couldn't access and didn't try to reach. Marshall had driven separately and already left. He'd nodded to me in the hallway outside courtroom 177. A silent acknowledgement that we'd talk later when the formality wore off. Pilar turned to me. "I need to get to the foundation office," she said. "Meeting at 10:30. She stepped closer and hugged me, first time since I'd been discharged from Memorial Hermann in June. A real hug, 2 seconds of actual contact, arms around shoulders, her cheek briefly touching mine. Then she released and walked down the steps toward her car without looking back. Some goodbyes don't need elaboration. I went home, made coffee, sat in my study, reading through Foundation quarterly reports that had accumulated during the trial proceedings. At 2:45 that afternoon, my phone buzzed. "Pilar. Coming by at 3. Need to show you something." She arrived at exactly 3 p.m. carrying a manila file folder, thick enough to contain serious work. Set it on my desk without preamble and opened it to the executive summary page. "Low-cost housing for senior veterans," she said. "Houston, Phase 1, 200 units, $45 million budget foundation funding, plus federal matching grants. I've been working on this for 3 weeks." I looked at the summary, then flipped through the supporting documentation. Architectural renderings, contractor bids, demographic analysis, timeline projections, funding structure, partnership agreements with VA Houston, and 3 local veteran service organizations. 3 weeks of research during the trial, while sitting through plea hearings and sentencing preparations, and victim impact statement drafts. She'd been channeling everything, the anger, the grief, the waiting for justice into something concrete and useful. As Phase 2 is another 300 units. She continued, flipping to a later section. Contingent on Phase 1 completion and occupancy rates. Total project timeline 4 years. Total impact 500 low-income senior veterans housed in quality accessible units within Houston city limits. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her. The girl who'd learned to ride a bicycle without needing anyone to hold the seat had become the woman who turned family trauma into housing for strangers who needed it. "Do you want to run it?" I asked. Pilar looked at me directly. "Do you trust me, Dad?" The question sat between us, not accusatory, not defensive, just honest. A real question that deserved a real answer. I thought about the 14 days she'd sat with a secret and true love both. About the list of financial discrepancies I'd given her, knowing exactly how she'd use them. About her standing in that bathroom watching her husband reveal himself, while her father lay vulnerable in a hospital bed. Trust isn't rebuilt in declarations. It's rebuilt in tasks assigned and completed in decisions made and honored in the slow accumulation of reliability over time. "I'm learning again," I said. Pilar picked up the file folder without saying thank you. I didn't want thanks. I wanted her to do the work, prove the trust was earned, build something that mattered. She understood that without me saying it. She left at 3:17 p.m. The file stayed on my desk. 2 days later, I signed the authorization paperwork and transferred the initial funding. 6 months after that, ground broke on Phase 1. The following Friday evening, November 29th, Marshall and I sat at a corner table in a Houston Heights restaurant where we'd first sat in 1987 when we were both young and knew nothing except we both liked not too expensive whiskey and honest conversation. We were both 60 years old now. The restaurant had changed ownership 3 times since 1987, but the corner table remained, and they still carried Balvenie 14 year, the kind we'd been drinking since we could afford. It could afford better now, but didn't want it. We didn't discuss the hospital, didn't discuss Caspian or Sherman or the trial. Forbidden topics by unspoken agreement we'd done, that work it was finished, no need to revisit. Marshall talked about a fishing trip to Lake Conroe he'd missed in August during the investigation. And friends said the base were biting like they knew something we didn't, he said. Pulled in 7 in 2 hours. I was sitting in a hospital parking lot reviewing security footage. You'll go next summer, I said. Already booked the cabin. I told him about the new office lease I'd signed the previous week, Midtown location, $18 million 10-year commitment. Felt good to plan that far ahead again, I said. Marshall raised his glass slightly in acknowledgement. We drank in comfortable silence. The kind of silence that only happens between people who have known each other long enough that conversation becomes optional. 37 years of friendship college roommates who'd somehow stayed in each other's orbits through marriages and divorces and business failures and successes, and now this. When the check came, I paid. Marshall didn't argue. Next time he'd pay. We'd been trading rounds since 1987. We stood to leave. I placed my hand on Marshall's shoulder. For 1 second, just 1 second, no words needed or offered. He nodded slightly once. The depth of 37 years expressed in single second of physical contact and one nod. Some debts transcend words, transcend payment, transcend everything, except the simple fact of showing up when needed. We left the restaurant in different directions because that's what parallel lives do. They run alongside, never intersecting, always close. I drove home that night through Houston traffic past Memorial Hermann Hospital on Fannin Street, past the building where it all happened. I didn't look at it. Didn't need to. The building was just a building now. The pillow was just a pillow. And I was just a man driving home through Friday evening traffic, thinking about senior veteran housing and foundation quarterly reports, and whether I'd remember to buy groceries before the weekend. 7 months after they arrested him, I still checked the pillow every night before my head touched it. January in Houston doesn't feel like winter anywhere else. The temperature dropped to 53 degrees that evening, cold enough for a jacket, but not cold enough to justify the gas fireplace. I came home after a long day of foundation meetings and ate dinner alone at my kitchen table. Grilled chicken, salad, glass of water. The meals you eat when you live by yourself, and cooking for one person feels performative. I climbed the stairs at 10:30. The room overlooked the garden I'd planted before my wife died 3 years ago. Japanese maples, azaleas, a small koi pond that needed cleaning more often than I remembered. From the window, I could see downtown Houston, glowing orange against the night sky, the city I'd lived in for 35 years, defended through 14 nights of fire that came from my own pillow. I pulled back the comforter and looked at the pillow. White cotton cover, medium density. Standard issue from the linen service I'd hired after coming home from Memorial Hermann. I'd thrown away every pillow I owned in June and started fresh as if contamination could transfer through fabric Caspian had never touched. 7 months. Every night the same ritual. Stand beside the bed, look at the pillow, touch it with my hand to confirm it's just cotton, and fill. Lie down slowly, wait for the burning that doesn't come. That night I lay down at 10:42. No fire, no sensation of glass particles cutting into skin from the inside. No waking at 3 a.m. with my throat raw. Just the weight of my head on cotton, the soft give of proper fill, the ordinary experience of lying down after a long day. I closed my eyes at 10:53. I didn't wake until 6:12 the next morning, 8 hours straight through. No nightmares about room 812. No lying awake running through evidence lists and legal strategies. Just sleep. The kind your body falls into when it finally believes the danger has passed. First thought wasn't about Caspian or the trial or Sherman Gallagher. First thought was Marshall's fishing trip to Lake Conroe, the one he'd missed 7 months ago, sitting in a hospital parking lot, reviewing security footage of a man poisoning his father-in-law. I picked up my phone and called him. He answered on the first ring. You said the base were good at Lake Conroe that day in June, I said. You still want to try again? Saturday, Marshall replied. 5 a.m., my boat. I'll bring the Balvenie. See you then. 20 seconds. No mention of Caspian's plea agreement, Pilar's housing project, or room 812. Just a fishing trip. Just 2 men in their 60s planning to spend Saturday morning on a lake probably catching nothing. I hung up and sat on the edge of my bed. Some people measure survival by what they kept. I measured it by who answered. I stood up, left the pillow behind me without checking it again, and went downstairs to make coffee. The pillow was just a pillow now. And to you listening to my story, Remember, this trust is precious, but vigilance keeps it from being weaponized against you. Looking back, I realized my biggest mistake wasn't trusting Caspian. It was ignoring the small signs that something was wrong, the unexplained financial questions, the urgency to get paperwork signed, the way he positioned himself as my protector while slowly destroying me. Family betrayal often starts this way, with someone convincing you they're helping. Don't make my mistake. When someone close to you starts acting like your guardian without being asked question, why? Family betrayal cuts deeper than any stranger's harm, because it comes wrapped in love and concern. But surviving it isn't about revenge. It's about documentation boundaries and protecting yourself even when it feels disloyal. I believe God put me through those 14 nights for a reason, to teach me that love without discernment is vulnerability waiting to be exploited. I survived exactly long enough to build the case rebuild trust with my daughter and learn that the people who show up when you're burning aren't always the ones you expect. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you faced family betrayal? How did you protect yourself while protecting your heart? If you know someone who needs this message, please share it with them. And if you're new here, consider subscribing to Revenge Dad for more true stories about justice, survival, and rebuilding after betrayal. Your support means everything. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. Final reminder, some details in this story have been fictionalized for storytelling and reflection. But the core message about trust, vigilance, and survival is what I hope stays with you.